A potential hostile encounter with China now dominates the United States military planning, and vice versa. What would a war look like? Who would win? Before we get to that, let's take a minute to explain why our military experts have decided to discuss this potentially very real and, quite frankly, terrifying scenario. After the end of World War II and especially the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's preeminent power, supreme in military, economic, technological, and even cultural influence. After 1991, the United States was so strong that some experts believed it had transcended superpower status. According to their theory, it had instead ascended into a hyperpower, a state that dominates all other states in every domain in the international system. The world had become a unipolar one, even leading some observers in the 1990s and part of the 2000s, most famously Francis Fukuyama, to declare an end of history and the final triumph of liberal democracy as the last form of human political organization. However, the 2000s and 2010s threw some cold water on this theory. Costly American military expeditions in the Middle East, the 2008 financial crisis, Russia's expansionist ambitions under Vladimir Putin, Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs, and above all, the economic and military rise of China, all undermine the notion of unipolarity. By the middle of the 2010s, the Pentagon proposed its third offset strategy, which tacitly acknowledged that the unipolar moment was, if not over, at least under threat by the emerging coalition of authoritarian powers, led by China, who were opposed to the international order led by the United States. The United States was therefore shifting its military posture away from the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaigns which dominated its strategy following 9/11, when the unipolar moment was near its height, and toward competition with and deterrence of other states, especially China. This is why the US is currently heavily oriented toward preparing for a potential adversarial encounter with China. Let's dive into what kind of conflict might unfold and which side could emerge victorious. We can begin with a comparison of the size of the two forces. With 1.4 billion people, China is the second most populous country in the world, having been surpassed by India in April 2023. It has the world's largest military with almost 2.2 million active personnel. The United States military ranks third in size with almost 1.4 million active duty personnel. When adding in reservists, the numbers increase to 3.35 million and 2.2 million respectively. China also has the world's largest navy, with 425 fleet units in its active naval inventory as of August 21, 2023. This number excludes smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries, presumably its huge fishing fleet that has acted as a de facto maritime militia in disputed waters. Meanwhile, the United States has 243 units in its active naval inventory, excluding smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries. The United States has the world's largest Air Force, with 5,217 active aircraft as of 2022. China ranks a distant third with 1,991. When counting the total number of military aircraft with all branches combined, China's numerical disadvantage in the skies becomes more pronounced, as the United States has 13,247 aircraft among all of its military branches, while China ranks a very distant third again at 3,285. When it comes to air power at sea, the United States has 2,464 aircraft, while China's People's Liberation Army Navy (PLAN) has only 437. This is an important distinction and reveals that many of China's advantages are only surface deep. The numerical difference in the makeup of the two forces is important. A war between the United States and China would take place in the area close to the Chinese mainland, in the territory around the First Island Chain, a string of countries that stretch from Japan to Indonesia. China would be able to concentrate all of its resources there, and its supply lines will be much shorter. In contrast, the United States has global commitments, with Russia exerting pressure on Eastern Europe, Iran and its allies in the Middle East, and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. All of these hotspots demand America's attention. The United States would also need to ship its supplies and replacements across the Pacific. These supply lines will be long and vulnerable to attack, the tyranny of distance. The United States has qualitative advantages, however. China's army has not seen major combat operations in almost half a century. The last time was the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, where the PLA had a poor showing indeed, against the Vietnamese. In contrast, the United States military has had decades of combat experience and a buildup of institutional knowledge that the PLA simply does not have. It has more experienced soldiers, sailors, marines, and officers. The Chinese military has engaged in a large buildup and conducted extensive drills and war games with partners such as Russia, but there is no substitute for the real thing. Russia's poor performance in Ukraine shows that, and its armed forces had more experience than China's currently does. The United States Air Force not only has numerical superiority over the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but a qualitative advantage in those planes. Although it may not seem this way at first, China has one fifth-generation fighter jet, the Chengdu J-20. China may have over 200 of these in service, a number which could hit as high as 1,000 by 2030 if current production rates continue. It may also have over 240 of the advanced fourth-generation plus J-16 fighters in service. This is a formidable force for the PLAAF. In contrast, the United States has only built 187 of its best fifth-generation fighter jets, the F-22 Raptor. The last one was delivered in 2012, and the Air Force has no plans to order any more. However, the United States can supplement the extremely high-quality Raptor with the fifth-generation F-35 Lightning II. Over 960 F-35s have been delivered as of August 2023. The United States also has thousands of advanced fourth-generation fighter jets like the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F-18 Super Hornet available. And all of them come with better trained and more experienced pilots than their Chinese counterparts. Although China has closed the gap, the United States is still supreme in the world's skies, and in an all-out air battle, the Americans would eventually establish air superiority. The war at sea is also not favorable to China. The People's Liberation Army Navy may have a bigger fleet in terms of sheer numbers, but the United States Navy has purposely chosen to pursue a different strategy than its Chinese counterpart. Numbers aren't everything. Many of the Chinese vessels are small and would prove relatively poor in a military confrontation. In contrast, the USN operates sturdier, more powerful vessels. For example, the PLAN has 3 aircraft carriers, only one of which uses a modern catapult system. The USN has 11, all of which are more modern than the first 2 Chinese carriers. China has plans to make more aircraft carriers in the years to come, but as of now, the United States has a significant advantage. Additionally, China has a serious shortage of trained naval aviators. The PLAN is trying its best to catch up, but it's still far short. As a conflict between the United States and China would mainly be fought in the seas and skies around the First Island chain, with comparatively limited land operations, the traditional balance of power should favor the United States in a head-to-head confrontation. However, China has recognized this and has adapted with a strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD. One of the things that marked the United States' emergence as a supposed hyperpower following the end of the Cold War was its ability to project power anywhere on the globe within hours. Perhaps one of the best examples was the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011. This complicated military operation occurred without the Pakistani government's knowledge, and there was little that Pakistan could do about it except raise a protest afterward. After the end of the Cold War, the United States had no peer competitor in the international system, which could prevent it from using its military resources in the way it wanted. However, this began to change with China's military buildup. China's A2AD strategy sounds complicated, but it's relatively simple. First, it is to deny its adversaries freedom of movement in the disputed region, anti-access. To do this, it will utilize certain assets, especially cheap precision ballistic and cruise missiles, to destroy key targets in offensive strikes. The second leg of the strategy is to use defensive systems to deny the enemy the ability to operate in territory controlled by it or other friendly powers. For example, China would try to use its stockpile of thousands of cheap ballistic missiles to destroy expensive American ships, especially aircraft carriers, bases, and long supply lines to prevent the United States from moving into disputed regions like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Cheap ballistic missiles destroying expensive carrier groups would not only prove deadly and costly, it would prevent the United States from being able to project its power into the First Island chain and the Chinese interior. This is the opposite of what happened during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96, when the United States sent 2 carrier groups to the area, The Chinese did not have the resources to deal with this projection of American power and had to back down. The story would be very different today, and the move far more dangerous on the part of the United States. Chinese air and missile attacks on US naval assets, supply lines, and bases in Japan, South Korea, and even as far out as Guam would take advantage of the tyranny of distance to prevent the United States from being able to fight the war for the long haul. The United States might be able to establish air and naval superiority with its higher quality planes and ships in a confrontation, but it could have a hard time replacing losses and bringing more resources over. Meanwhile, China would be operating close to its own territory. The supply lines would be much shorter and easier to defend with its air and sea defense systems, and all of China's resources would be concentrated here. In addition to these kinetic assets, China has tried to develop its electronic and cybernetic warfare capabilities to further disrupt the US military capability. China's military buildup and its A2AD weapons has posed the most serious challenge to US military might since the Cold War. It is why many experts believe that the United States is slowly but steadily losing its traditional military superiority in the Indo-Pacific region. To defeat China's A2AD strategy, the Pentagon developed its third offset strategy. China hopes that the development of advanced A2AD capabilities will deter the United States from even disputing its expansionist moves. This is why for the Pentagon it is important to maintain forward presence capability. It must be able to defeat the attempts to impede the movement of American military forces and surge them forward in a combat-credible posture. According to the US Army's Center for Lessons Learned, the third offset strategy involves forces that are or can rapidly get forward, survive a withering Chinese or Russian assault, and blunt the adversary's aggression. It is almost reminiscent of a boxer trying to duck and slip past a barrage of long jabs to get inside his opponent's range and deliver power blows. The United States is currently developing technologies to better prepare it to pursue this strategy. For example, these new technologies would involve better artificial intelligence to enable human officers to make faster and more informed decisions. The integration of human and unmanned platforms, like the Sea Hunter autonomous drone ship, would also be part of the third offset strategy. Other technologies like ship-borne hypersonic missiles and the Helios laser system can also be considered part of the third offset strategy, as it is hoped that the laser will add a layer of protection to the US Navy's ships from the Chinese ballistic and cruise missile threat. The laser is also ideal for countering drones. The first Helios laser began seeing service in the third quarter of fiscal year 2022, and the Navy requested $35 million in its 2023 budget for Helios systems, when they will begin to become operational at sea. However, as dazzling as the third offset strategy technologies are, they are still works in progress. The United States neglected countermeasures against China's A2AD strategy as it pursued its counterinsurgency and counterterrorism efforts in the war on terror. Under current conditions, the United States military still uses many technologies and systems that are not well designed to counter the strategy China is pursuing. China still cannot defeat the United States in a head-to-head military confrontation, but because of geography, it does not necessarily need to. All it needs to do is prevent the United States from projecting enough power past the First Island chain to defeat its expansionist ambitions. As part of its strategy, American military bases in Japan would be targeted in the opening shots of the war, to destroy troops and equipment, prevent the stockpiling of supplies, and disrupt the United States' strategy in the region. Air defense systems would take down some of the incoming missiles, but China has thousands in its arsenal, and its attacks would certainly do a great deal of damage. Wargames done at the Pentagon and defense think tanks have repeatedly confirmed these disadvantages. In a January 2023 scenario run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States, with the help of Japan and Taiwan, defeated an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, but the casualties were enormous, with losses in dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of military personnel, with the US position on the international stage undermined for years afterward. China suffered heavily too. However, CSIS warned that deterrence needed to be strengthened immediately. Other wargames were even less kind. A 2020 wargame run by the Pentagon over Taiwan and other scenarios had the United States failing miserably because gathering ships, aircraft, and other forces in a way that would let them reinforce one another made them sitting ducks for Chinese missile attacks. To make matters worse, the United States lost access to its electronic networks from the get-go. upending the information dominance strategy it has used so successfully starting in the Gulf War. In response to the 2020 wargame, the Pentagon is looking to shore up its contested logistics, possibly through the use of rockets to fly above the war zone. It's also looking to find ways to aggregate power virtually rather than physically. Then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Hyten said of it, "You have to aggregate the mass fires, but it doesn't have to be a physical aggregation. It could be a virtual aggregation for multiple domains. Acting at the same time under a single command structure allows the fire to come in on anybody. It allows you to disaggregate to survive." He admitted this was exceedingly difficult to do, however. Finally, the United States would need to improve the defense of its networks against hackers, with a hacker-proof combat cloud. For now, though, these things are only speculation. What is not, however, is the United States' advantage in submarine warfare. China's missile capability has made it increasingly dangerous for the United States and its allies to project power behind the first island chain with surface ships, but the submarine force is much better protected. That's why China raised such a big protest about the AUKUS deal that would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines. Submarines are ideal for the implementation of the United States' third offset strategy. American nuclear-powered submarines can operate for months. They are quiet and dive deep, making them difficult to detect. They can also launch conventional or nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles to strike sensitive targets. The United States submarine fleet would make any invasion of Taiwan or other amphibious operations in the first island chain a costly proposition for the Chinese military. The presence of these submarines also gives the United States significant conventional or nuclear first strike options to attack targets on land, such as Chinese military installations, which house the ballistic missiles that are such a threat to surface ships and land bases. China's PLAN is trying to close the submarine gap. At the moment, though, the bulk of its underwater fleet consists of diesel-electric submarines. They are quieter than nuclear submarines when running on electric power, but most surface to charge their batteries and are much louder when running on diesel power during this process. As of March 2023, China has a fleet of 56 submarines, but only 6 of them are nuclear-powered. The disparity means that the United States can carry out stealthier and longer operations under the water than China's Navy can. If a war did break out between the United States and China, the US submarine fleet would swing into action and attack Chinese naval assets, land bases, and shipping. The latter is especially important and reveals the United States' ace in the hole. China depends heavily on foreign food and energy imports. From its perspective, China's attempt to expand its influence in the South China Sea can be seen as an act of self-preservation. Critical shipping routes worth trillions of dollars go through these waters. Whoever controls them not only controls those dollars, but the ability for the countries in the area to access the resources. If China succeeds in closing the South China Sea shipping lanes, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other American allies in the region would have a far harder time importing the resources they need. The same principle applies with China, however. A blockade of strategic shipping lanes such as the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Luzon would cripple the commerce China depends on that comes through these straits, and much of its commerce is vital for its basic needs. While some of the Chinese missiles can reach that far, the assets being used to enforce the blockade would be better protected by distance and have more time to react to an attack. China is testing hypersonic missiles and is regarded as being ahead of the United States in the race for these weapons that would help its offensive reach. However, they are not ready for prime time and have not been widely deployed in the Chinese military yet. China would also greatly risk its naval and air assets in an attempt to disrupt the blockade. It would be the type of head-on confrontation with the United States Navy and Air Force that would put the Chinese military at a disadvantage. China may be the world's largest manufacturing nation, but it is still unable to feed or fuel itself, while the United States can. This would be the ultimate disadvantage in a wartime scenario, reminiscent of Germany's geographical disadvantages in World War I, when the Allied blockade deprived Germany of resources and slowly strangled it into starvation and submission. In a full-scale war, the United States would attempt a similar strategy. While China's missiles would ensure that the United States could not pull off a blockade in the same way the Royal Navy did in World War I, China would still be hard-pressed to break through it. So while the United States would be in danger in a confrontation in an area like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, it would not necessarily need to go there until China is steadily worn down by the blockade and attrition. The United States still has a military advantage over China, but China is trying its best to close that gap. With its population starting to decline and economic growth slowing down, the dangers of a war breaking out in the Indo-Pacific may be increasing, since the Chinese Communist leadership may begin to feel like its window of opportunity to remake the order in the region is closing. Regardless of how it would be fought, a war between the United States and China, even if contained, would be bloody and come at a huge price tag. Deterrence and diplomacy are more vital than ever. But what do you think? Who would have the advantage? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In recent years, nuclear threats, cyber risks, psychological warfare, and a military buildup suggest a potential conflict between China and the US. A major attack could lead to a prolonged struggle, with China's military advancements complicating US operations near its mainland. What would happen if the United States was attacked by China? First, let's do a quick review of the relationship between the United States and China in order to see what factors are at play here. Throughout this brief history, there will also be highlights of the type of warfare that China has conducted in the past, thus alluding to the weapons and power they currently have at their disposal. Although allies against Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, these superpowers clashed soon after over political ideologies, communism, and democracy. This escalation culminated in the Korean War. Korea now separated between North and South, though traditionally East and West. The communist-backed North Korea, backed by a Chinese-Soviet alliance, squaring off against the American-backed South. These alliances are similar to the geopolitical landscape we see today. A different war than the previous world wars, the Korean War had offshoots like the Taiwan Strait crisis, a civil battle between the Communist People's Republic of China and the more capitalist Republic of China. President Truman initially took a neutral stance. Commenting about the Taiwanese island of Formosa in January of 1950, the United States has no desire to obtain special rights or privileges or to establish military bases on Formosa at this time, nor does it have any intention of utilizing its armed forces to interfere in the present situation. The United States government will not pursue a course which will lead to involvement in the civil conflict in China. However, he took a quick about-face that same June, sending the US Naval 7th Fleet in an act of prevention, stating, "Communism has now passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war." This would be a continued trend by the Chinese government to stay out of the United Nations dictates and attempt to stronghold territories into their power. 20 years later, President Jimmy Carter sought to establish diplomatic relations with China, thus highlighting a continuous pendulum of peace and war between the two growing countries. From here on out, the US recognized the People's Republic of China and shifted their center of recognition from Taipei to Beijing, Carter saying, "The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China." This comment would live on to today, bolstering the One China policy. Yet despite American support of the policy, Taiwan remains vocally separate, and certain American actions throughout can be seen in support of these claims also, thus subverting the policy. For instance, Carter's Taiwan Relations Act enabled the American people and the people on Taiwan to maintain commercial, cultural, and other relations without official government representation and without diplomatic relations, thus creating a somewhat sovereign nation economically, even if not nationally. American attempts at diplomacy continued under President Ronald Reagan, who granted Taiwan the 6 assurances, which included commitments such as refraining from involvement in issues between the two Chinas. Yet Reagan also reaffirmed acknowledgement of the One China policy, an echo of Carter's statement and an internal effort for China to unify under one flag, particularly at a time when containment of the Soviet Union seemed necessary in order to curb its growth from getting out of control. Looking ahead to the late 2000s, we witnessed China's rise as an economic superpower, becoming the world's largest holder of US debt. Soon after, it claims the title of the world's second largest economy, signaling a growing threat. Beginning in his election bid, the Trump administration took a confrontational stance, criticizing China's trade practices and accusing it of exploiting the US. In 2020, he said, "China's pattern of misconduct is well known. For decades, they have ripped off the United States like no one has ever done before, Hundreds of billions of dollars a year were lost dealing with China, especially over the years during the prior administration. China raided our factories, offshored our jobs, gutted our industries, stole our intellectual property, and violated their commitments under the World Trade Organization. To make matters worse, they are considered a developing nation getting all sorts of benefits that others, including the United States, are not entitled to, while commenting on his garnering of a trade war in 2018, a tense expression of economic warfare, which is typically played out between trade partners, utilizing targeted tariffs on each other's imports. The US-China trade war had far-reaching economic repercussions, causing trade disruptions and exacerbating tensions between the two nations, but this was just the beginning. In 2021, the Trump administration also accused China of genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, targeting Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups. This almost occurred simultaneously with widespread protests erupting in Hong Kong. But what further ignited the tinderbox was the COVID-19 pandemic, which seemed to overshadow these issues. The novel illness spread rapidly from the Wuhan province across the globe, leading to speculations of it being an act of warfare. However, since the laboratory is operated by both Chinese and Americans, the true cause remains disputed. Still, the pandemic era brought an end to the protests. Everyone called to retreat to their homes in an effort to contain the spread. The global focus shifted towards responding to the illness. Unrest and distrust amounted within the US, exacerbated by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the jungle of information for citizens to sort through. This contributed to the civil unrest and confusion surrounding the nature of the American relationship with China. The outbreak of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine further complicated the matter, with China's support for Russia and United States' overt support of Ukraine mirroring past conflicts. Concerns also arise regarding China's military activities in the South China Sea and its significant investments in cyber capabilities, methods of unconventional warfare which will be examined further in the video. These factors raise the possibility of a potential attack on the US, and war seemed, as it often does, on the brink. This historical overview has touched upon economic and potentially biological weapons, as well as land grabs from China, but there are other crucial aspects to consider. In recent years, nuclear threats, cybersecurity risks, psychological warfare, and a buildup of conventional warfare resources point to a pre-conflict posturing. A large-scale engagement spurred on by an attack could escalate into a protracted struggle, utilizing these different facets of warfare and sources of power. China has made significant advancements in military capabilities, particularly in areas that pose challenges to the US in conducting effective military operations near its mainland. The Chinese Communist Party has often been characterized as a bully, using various tactics to expand its influence. These tactics include acquiring significant portions of America's farmland, a country heavily dependent on China for its manufactured goods. Additionally, China has employed unconventional methods, such as constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea to disrupt shipping lanes and undermine regional stability for its own benefit. These predatory actions not only highlight China as a threat to the United States and global peace, but also demonstrate their determination and ingenuity in asserting themselves as the leading superpower. China's military modernization has increasingly challenged US defense capabilities in Asia. Although China still lags behind the United States in terms of overall military strength and operational skills, it has notably improved in the areas mentioned earlier. Furthermore, President Xi Jinping's commitment to making the People's Liberation Army a world-class military by 2035, combined with China's surpassing the United States as the world's largest navy in 2014, sends a clear signal that the competition is becoming more intense. US commanders expressed deep concerns about the relentless development of Chinese air defenses, which pose a significant threat to operational capabilities in or near Chinese airspace during a conflict. In 1996, a substantial number of China's 500-plus long-range surface-to-air missiles, SAM systems, were mere replicas of the outdated Russian SA-2 missile, limited to a range of approximately 35 kilometers. However, by 2010, China had boldly deployed around 200 launchers for their more advanced double-digit SAMs. These formidable missiles boast superior seekers and extended ranges of up to 200 kilometers. Coupled with highly capable fighter aircraft and the introduction of airborne warning and control system-equipped planes, the Chinese Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) has emerged as a formidable and unwavering obstacle. Nevertheless, US Air Forces have responded with unwavering determination, bolstering their penetration capabilities by incorporating cutting-edge stealth aircraft and new SEAD (suppression of enemy air defenses) aircraft. In recent years, both China and the United States have showcased hypersonic capabilities. Members of Congress have expressed their dissatisfaction with the perceived lack of progress by the Pentagon in developing and deploying new hypersonic weapons. In 2017, Russia became the first to deploy the Kinzhal, a hypersonic short-range ballistic missile, followed by the Avangard, a hypersonic boost glide vehicle, in 2019. China joined the race in 2020 with the deployment of the Dongfeng 17 DF-17 system, a road-mobile hypersonic boost glide system. What we are concerned about is falling behind in the development of new hypersonic weapon capabilities, said Senator Marsha Blackburn to Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall during a May 2022 hearing. Regarding their nuclear capabilities, the RAND Project Air Force Nuclear Scorecard assesses the stability of the bilateral nuclear relationship, focusing on crisis stability rather than one side's advantage. It evaluates both sides' ability to retaliate in the event of a first strike. When both sides possess a survivable second strike capability, the incentives for a first strike diminish, enhancing stability. Factors such as offensive weapons quantity, range, accuracy, and nuclear target details are considered. The threat of nuclear warfare is a significant concern in any conflict between two nuclear-armed powers like China and the United States. Both countries possess large arsenals of nuclear weapons, and the use of these weapons could lead to catastrophic consequences on a global scale. The potential for escalation to nuclear warfare adds a layer of complexity and danger to any conflict between these two nations. China has made significant advancements in both quantity and quality. Enhancements include road-mobile DF-31, CSS-9, and DF-31A ICBMs, as well as Type 094 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, carrying JL-2 SLBMs. China is also developing next-generation road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, ballistic submarines, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Furthermore, the potential for biochemical warfare cannot be ignored. A report with low confidence, published by the Energy Department in 2023, supports the speculation that the COVID-19 pandemic may have resulted from a lab leak in Wuhan. This facility openly engaged in various biological testing, involving both China and the United States. Given the extensive research programs in biology and chemistry of these two nations, the use of biological or chemical weapons could have devastating consequences for military and civilian populations alike. According to the World Health Organization, biological agents like anthrax, botulinum toxin, and plague pose a significant public health challenge, capable of causing widespread fatalities in a short period. These weapons consist of microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, or fungi, or toxic substances deliberately produced and released to induce disease and death in humans, animals, or plants. These unseen threats have the ability to spread rapidly and unknowingly, increasing their impact and reach. As witnessed during the response to COVID-19, travel and contact were severely restricted to prevent further spread and loss of life, thus revealing and stoking fear of contact which may pass on these biologics. The fact that these weapons can be transported through air, water, and various climates under the radar makes them an even more terrifying means of warfare. The consequences extend beyond immediate casualties, also creating opportunities for psychological operations to exploit the psyche of survivors in the aftermath. The complex nature of biochemical warfare and its potential impact on global security and stability underscores the need for heightened vigilance and cooperation between nations. International efforts to prevent the proliferation and use of biological and chemical weapons must be reinforced, accompanied by robust mechanisms for early detection, rapid response, and effective countermeasures. Psychological operations, commonly known as propaganda, encompass a wide range of tactics that can rapidly disseminate, much like biological warfare, but with the toxin being transported in thoughts and ideas. These operations aim to influence the perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of both enemy decision-makers and the general population. In today's digital age, where information is consumed at an unprecedented rate and our lives are heavily intertwined with technology, we have become highly susceptible to these operations. The 2020 election and claims of fraud serve as prime examples of the challenges posed by an overwhelming amount of information and exacted interference, making it difficult to discern truth from opinion and fact from fiction. We can already observe unique applications of psychological operations, such as the contrasting treatment of the popular app TikTok in China and the United States. In China, TikTok is primarily presented as an educational platform with restricted access, particularly for children. On the other hand, in America, TikTok has been associated with the youth's struggle with depression and other mental illnesses, which have seen a significant rise during the COVID-19 pandemic. These operations encompass various tactics, including propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and strategies designed to undermine the morale and cohesion of adversaries. In recent years, there have been claims linking internet trolls to China, with the intention of exacerbating civil disputes within America, although concrete evidence is lacking. However, it is important to note that these threats are not the only ones that exist, particularly in this digital age. By understanding the complexity and potential impact of psychological operations, we can better navigate the challenges posed by misinformation and manipulation in our increasingly interconnected world. China has actively developed its cyber capabilities mirroring the United States advancements. The country has invested billions of dollars in supporting these programs, underscoring its commitment to cyber warfare. In the event of an attack on the United States, cyber attacks would target critical infrastructure, military installations, and communication networks. Moreover, cyber warfare could disrupt not only essential services within the United States, but also vital systems like oil and gas pipelines, rail networks, and power grids. For instance, a cyber attack on the US power grid could result in widespread blackouts, affecting millions of homes and businesses. This would disrupt communications, potentially causing banks to go offline, hospitals to close, and air traffic to be grounded, leading to chaos and potential loss of life. Consider how much of American lives are digitized or on the grid. The fear of this potential has driven many to prepare with go bags and other end-of-the-world scenario preparations. Similarly, a cyber attack on water infrastructure could disrupt water supply and treatment systems, posing a risk to public health and safety. A recent survey conducted by Verizon revealed that only 15% of public safety organizations felt they were very prepared against cyber attacks. This highlights the urgent need for increased investment in cybersecurity measures to protect critical infrastructure and ensure the safety and well-being of the American population. To strengthen the call for readiness and emphasize the importance of recognizing potential threats, it is crucial to understand the significant risks posed by cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. As US Secretary of State Antony Blinken described in May 2022, China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. In the event of a Chinese attack, potential targets may include traditional targets such as US air bases in Asia, naval aircraft carriers, military installations in the Indo-Pacific, critical infrastructure spots, the US mainland, space assets, and US allies, but also could be direct to the people and akin to some of these unconventional methods. Sun Tzu, a renowned Chinese military strategist whose integral work, The Art of War, which almost all American military officials read at one point of their career, writes about a most beneficial type of war. In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. That means that the most beneficial means of war for an adversarial country is not for the cities and towns to be turned to ruins, but rather for a surrender to happen slowly, gradually. The mistrust that Americans have for their government and the civil fractions we have seen over the past several years reveal a different sort of susceptibility. Pair this with the strategically placed attacks both on cyber infrastructure and psychologically right to our pockets, and it's not difficult to imagine a swift takeover, one that may put us under siege without even noticing. This also begs the question, has the attack already begun? Over half of the young, up-and-coming Generation Z support the Marxist Communist Party, which earlier on in this video, we reviewed that the United States was and still is at the other end of an ideological battle, and which is at the center of the conflict between these two countries and their allies. Yet, in an effort of deterrence, leaders will take stock in the knowledge that there is mutual interest to both of these countries to maintain a civil relationship. Both China and the United States share a common interest in maintaining global stability and avoiding any military confrontation that may disrupt the delicate balance. As seen during the tariffs imposed by President Trump in 2018, an economic war The US trade relationship is a serious lever to pull within a wartime or diplomatic situation, but one that demands either side to be respected by the other when considering the potential for attack. American companies exported $192 billion in goods and services to China in 2021, constituting 7.5% of US exports. While expanding foreign trade can disrupt US employment, trade with China also creates and supports a significant number of American jobs. Exports to China support over 1 million US jobs, and Chinese companies invested in the United States employ over 160,000 workers. While the tension may always seem to just be on the cusp of breaking into war, America can maintain positive diplomatic relations with China by setting clear objectives, which require cooperation, promote mutual benefit, and are considerate of national security. With actions like this, we can effectively deter any impending attack that may threaten our collective peace. However, if this threat is left unattended or ignored, or worse, underestimated, then we could very well experience a gross advancement of Chinese presence on American soil. Whether through an overt attack supported by boots on the ground, subtle means like psychological warfare, widespread biological weaponization, or a mixture of all, the threat does remain. So what do you think? Will China and the US eventually end up in some form of conflict? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. For all of the military advancements that China has made in recent years, it still can't compete with the US in one area: the skies. The US Air Force is a terrifying prospect for China for many reasons, not least because it knows that America leads the charge when it comes to the quality of its equipment and its pilots. And if war were to ever break out between the countries, China would find itself cowering before the might of America's craft. But why? China has a very strong military. It's the second largest military spender in the world, just behind the US, and it's ramping up its nuclear capabilities with every passing year. But when it comes to the skies, China pales in comparison, and Beijing knows it. The reason for China's fear starts with one of the most crucial aspects of warfare: sheer numbers. The simple fact is that the US's airborne capabilities stretch far beyond anything that China can handle. According to Global Firepower, America has a little over 660,000 Air Force personnel. Of course, not all of these are pilots. The US doesn't have the ability to send a 500,000-strong death fleet of planes in China's direction, but what it does have is an extensive infrastructure of pilots and support crews that can coordinate massive offensives that would cause major problems for Beijing. That's not to say that China doesn't have an impressive number of personnel itself. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has about 400,000 members. Impressive numbers, though over 260,000 fewer than the US Air Force. Of course, it's not just people who make up an Air Force. Equipment is a vital component. That's where the US really comes out on top. It has a total stock of 13,300 aircraft, 9,975 of which are combat-ready, compared to China's fleet of 3,166. In other words, the United States has about 4 times the number of aircraft that China has, meaning it would easily overwhelm the PLAAF in terms of sheer numbers. Digging deeper, it's clear that China has focused most of its Air Force spending on fighter jets, with the country having 1,199 of these types of planes available. But even that impressive number pales in comparison to the United States, which has 1,914 fighters, along with a far more versatile fleet of planes that go beyond dogfighting capabilities. For instance, the US has 962 fixed-wing transports compared to China's 288. It also has far more planes available for training, with China having less than a sixth of the 2,634 craft that the US can use to give its next generations of pilots some much-needed flight experience. No matter where you look, be it attack planes, tankers, helicopters, or special mission planes, America comes out on top every single time. Its air-based firepower is on a level that no other military can match. The US simply has more options when it comes to moving its troops around and conducting air missions against China or its territorial partners. That's not to say that the PLAAF is useless. It would be able to cause some damage to America's forces, but for every plane that Beijing could down, the US would have plenty in reserve, ready to replace it. In a war of attrition, China's stock would run low far sooner, giving the US complete dominance of the skies. Still, sheer numbers aren't the only way that a battle is won. quality of equipment is just as important, and what better place to look than the crown jewels of each country's fighters? For China, that crown jewel, at least right now, is the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, a stealth fighter that entered into service in 2018, following its maiden flight in 2011. It's a fifth-generation plane that was designed specifically to compete with America's F-22 Raptor. The plane is capable of a top speed of about 1,670 miles per hour and can fly for almost 2,800 miles before it needs to refuel. It has low jet engine intakes and is barely visible on a radar cross-section, making it ideal for sneak attacks, and it comes equipped with an active electronically scanned array (AESA) that transmits targeting data directly to its firing systems. Speaking of those firing systems, the craft comes equipped with an internal cannon that can be deployed during close-quarters combat. A pair of bays underneath the craft can hold several PL-10 air-to-air missiles, with another bay in its belly carrying larger PL-21 and PL-12CD missiles. In all, it's a flying death machine that can rain fire on an opponent through a combination of built-in guns and missile strikes. So it's no surprise that China is building as many as possible. Nikkei Asia even suggested that it built more J-20s in 2022 than the 187 F-22s that America manufactured, with plans in place to produce another 40 to 50 per year for the foreseeable future. Of course, not all of those craft will go straight into the PLAAF, with China having the opportunity to sell some. Still, it's an impressive fighter. And if its sole opponent in the US Air Force was the F-22 that it seems to have been built as a counterpart to, China would at least be able to claim parity with the United States. But it's not just the F-22 that China has to worry about. The F-35 is another of the US's best fighters, and the combined force of both would overwhelm the J-20. Where China is focusing most of its efforts on a single fighter, the US has two extremely advanced aircraft that give it more versatility. The F-22 is the closest to the J-20, with its top speed of about 1,500 miles per hour being just a smidge below the J-20's. It has an external radar cross-section, which makes it remarkably difficult to detect, and is able to supercruise. That means it's able to maintain supersonic speeds without the need for afterburners, making it even harder to detect. The thrust vectoring system built into the aircraft also makes it one of the most agile ever made. So even if the J-20 is faster than the F-22, it may not be able to hit it. It's worth focusing on the ability to supercruise a little more for a simple reason. The J-20 can't do it. In fact, none of the fighters in China's stock can, because they're all equipped with the WS-10 Taihang, a turbofan engine that delivers high thrust but can't maintain supersonic speeds without engaging afterburners. That's a problem for stealth operations. Whenever a craft engages its afterburners, it essentially gives the game away when it comes to its location. So for a J-20 to maintain supersonic speeds, it has to let the US know where it is. But for the F-22 and F-35, supercruising can be used to maintain high speeds, with a large weapons load, while the craft itself essentially appears as barely visible on most radar systems. As for the F-35, it's actually a touch slower than both the J-20 and F-22, being capable of hitting a top speed of 1,200 miles per hour. However, it has slightly more advanced avionics, the tech inside the craft, than the F-22. Both have advanced systems that include radar, sensors, and communication systems. However, the F-35 adds to that with a helmet-mounted display, which can show the pilot real-time information about both their plane and the surrounding environment. But the standout feature of this plane is its ability to take off from a very short runway before landing vertically. In other words, it's able to operate from bases that don't have large runways, such as assault ships and smaller airfields. That's a capability that neither the F-22 nor the J-20 can match. And of course, both the F-22 and F-35 have similar weapon systems, with cannons and air-to-air missiles to match the J-20. In a straight comparison, the J-20 seems to come out just about on top, but the F-22 is very close. And when combined with the more versatile F-35, America would definitely have the advantage in pure dogfighting capabilities. And when you add the ability to supercruise into the mix, America's top fighters have a clear advantage over China's in the stealth game. In short, China knows that it's chasing the US when it comes to its fighters. The J-20 is a direct response to the F-22, and even China's experiments with unmanned flights ape those already conducted by the US. Beijing is playing catch-up. And while it's closing the distance, it's far from achieving air superiority based on numbers or equipment. Speaking of air superiority, China is also terrified of America's Air Force because it takes a very different approach to the PLAAF. China tends to focus on using its planes to support its ground troops, rather than to establish a superior presence in the skies. It's a similar approach to the one that Russia has tried to use in Ukraine, with planes flying low to take out ground-based targets. But this approach has two problems. First, it makes planes vulnerable. Providing support to ground-based troops means flying low, and the lower you go, the closer you get to anti-air defense. This is a lesson that Russia has learned quickly during its invasion of Ukraine, with Ukraine's anti-air defenses already being responsible for shooting down at least 130 craft by August 2023, according to RAND. The fact that China takes a similar approach will be terrifying to Beijing because it means that it's tactically outmatched by the US. And when you consider the fact that the US has far superior anti-air equipment to Ukraine, the situation would only become more dire for China's pilots. Second, China's ground-focused approach naturally takes its focus away from the skies. That's where America could come swooping in to dominate China's airspace thanks to 5 letters, COMAO. COMAO stands for Composite Air Operations, and the idea behind this tactic is to bring a versatile range of capabilities into a single airborne attack. Typically, that means several countries combining their forces and their craft in joint operations, where one set of planes may provide ground support, for instance, another set may circle the skies, defending against any fighters that would draw near. The ultimate goal is to create one large package of aircraft that combines their forces to essentially take over several hundred square miles of airspace. A COMAO usually has a package commander who coordinates the routes, timings, and targets for the aircraft, and because the package is so large, some COMAOs incorporate up to 100 planes and helicopters. There is built-in redundancy. If a craft or a mission fails, there are others on hand to replace it and launch a secondary assault. This is a problem for China. With its planes generally focused on the ground, the US could use COMAO tactics to dominate the skies above. Its fighters will be able to launch aerial assaults, both on China's planes and targets on the ground, while the PLAAF would lose the ability to escape danger by gaining altitude, because more American flyers would be stationed higher up to greet them. Combine all of this with the fact that COMAOs usually bring together multiple countries, the US would likely involve NATO in its operations, and you get exceptionally coordinated attacks that far outstrip anything that the PLAAF can do. In short, the US would have complete air superiority. And even without support from other countries or NATO, America has such a versatile stock of aircraft that it could essentially launch COMAOs on its own, with China having little recourse due to only coming close to matching the states in fighter plane numbers, with everything else falling behind. Versatility is clearly the key, and it's the lack of it that would have Beijing running scared if the US started launching complex aerial attacks combined with anti-air defenses. Still, China is at least trying to make up for its lack of aerial tactical nous with new anti-air defenses. In November 2022, the People's Liberation Army (PLA) unveiled the FK-3000 air defense missile system, along with 2 others, the HQ-16FE and the Red 11 systems, at Airshow China 2022. It was the FK-3000 that stole the show, as it comes equipped with a powerful air defense missile that can deflect most standard ammunition used by fighter planes. Add to that a mini-missile designed to resist cluster bombs and a special transmitter to jam radio signals, and it's a powerful anti-air force. Even better for China, much of the vehicle that holds this weaponry is remote-controlled. That includes its transporter, erector, launcher, and radar (TELAR) platform, which holds a turret that can be fired remotely to fend off attacks. More support comes from a pair of auxiliary vehicles, again unmanned, that can handle ground combat to defend the main vehicle. The FK-3000 is impressive, but it can't do anything against America's fighters. Instead, it's designed to ward off attack helicopters, cruise missiles, and similar large targets. No stealth detection capabilities means it has its limitations. All of those munitions and equipment could, and likely would, be deployed by the US in a COMAO attack, but the very nature of COMAOs means that China's anti-air defenses would be able to do little against anything other than large targets that are somewhat close to the ground. For the many craft that are either out of range or equipped with stealth technology, the FK-3000 would essentially be useless. Again, we see Beijing doing what it's doing with fighters, playing catch-up. Of course, you could argue that the US couldn't launch an aerial attack from home soil to China. The distance is too great to fly from one country to the other, essentially protecting each one against the other's aerial forces, right? That's not the case. According to Al Jazeera, the United States maintains 750 bases around the world, with at least 220 of those bases being in Asian countries that could easily put the US into range. Japan is the frontrunner and a vital military partner to the US with 120 bases, South Korea coming in close behind with 73, Australia hosts 7, and will likely build more as its military ties to the US grow, with both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia having 10 US bases. Looking at a map of the world, you'll see why this is such a problem for China. Combined, those bases offer coverage from the east, west, and south. China is essentially surrounded by major countries that hosts US troops and could, in the event of war, become launching points for COMEOs and other American aerial operations. In contrast, China only has one official remote military base located in Djibouti, meaning it's still not within range, and certainly not to the extent that America is to Beijing. Granted, China is looking to expand its overseas presence. Stars and Stripes reports that Beijing may look to build new bases in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia in the coming years. Plus, its investments in infrastructure projects in many Asian and African countries provide it with some leverage to establish more bases in the future. But to achieve the type of coverage that the US has, China would need to establish a presence in South America and Canada, neither really being options for Beijing. China is trying to catch up once again. It's doing so covertly, especially with its loans for infrastructure projects that could place many smaller countries in its back pocket. But the US is far ahead in that game because it's established itself in several Asian countries that put it within striking distance of China. Simply put, America can launch attacks on China without Beijing being able to reciprocate, at least without a lot of effort and aircraft carriers, putting China at yet another aerial disadvantage. Still, if China had better pilot training, that would at least be something it could hold against the States. Unfortunately for Beijing, it doesn't. According to Air Education and Training Command, AETC, the US Air Force Academy pumps out over 3,400 cadets every year. Those cadets are training in the principles and techniques used to fly advanced planes and helicopters, in addition to receiving ground training, so they're at least somewhat effective if they're grounded. Some cadets also undergo officer development training, which improves their leadership and coordination skills. After completing this primary phase, the cadets are split into 3 groups, with each being an advanced training course focused on a specific type of craft. These groups include one for bombers and fighters, another for helicopter training, and yet another that teaches advanced operation of tankers and airlift planes. A 4th, and constantly growing, group is also selected to learn how to remotely fly unmanned craft. All told, a pilot cadet will get between 180 and 240 hours of flight training before they're deployed in the field, leaving them well equipped to handle almost anything thrown at them. As with everything else, the PLAAF lags behind in the training department. Beijing is aware of this too, which is why it's engaging in a concerted campaign to bring more Western influence into its training program. According to Sky News, the PLA started a recruitment drive in late 2022 aimed at attracting British military personnel to help train its pilots. The outlet says that around 30 former British pilots took the payday, with salaries reputed to be around £240,000, or approximately $300,000 per year. However, some are calling the move a breach of security. That makes sense. Not only do these British pilots have more experience than many of China's flyers, but they also understand Western aircraft. Who's to say they won't divulge secrets? This is obviously distressing news for all Western countries, including the US, but it's also an indicator that China is playing catch-up in training just as much as everywhere else. It wants to know how Western powers operate. It needs to find and benefit from experience that its own trainers simply don't have. And as long as it's offering so much money in exchange for that knowledge, it will be able to attract people who can improve its training outcomes. This could be a sign that China is getting desperate. And beyond splashing the cash to attract better trainers, it's also trying to force pilots through their training faster than ever before. In a July 2022 article, Le Monde reported that China had proudly proclaimed that cadets trained in the J-10, one of its multi-role fighters, had completed their training in 3 years rather than the standard 6. That was big news for Beijing. It had only started training pilots using the J-10s in 2010, with such a fast pilot turnaround being put down to an increased ability to conduct tactical training and live fore operations. But is that really the case? Or is Beijing making the same mistake that Moscow makes by failing to ensure that its cadets have enough flight hours to be effective once they're engaged in active warfare? What China claims as a victory in training efficiency could simply be a rush job that says something very different. We're scared of the US, and we need more pilots now. Beyond that, secrecy surrounds China's Air Force training, as it does with so much of the PLA's operations, with propaganda and the occasional news report being the main sources of what they actually do. Regardless, Beijing recognizes the superiority of Western training. If it didn't, it wouldn't be spending around $9 million per year on former British pilots. But even if the Brits can teach China a thing or two, there's one more reason for Beijing to cower in the face of America's aerial might: nuclear weapons. The US and China are both capable of launching nukes, with China's growing arsenal being an obvious cause for concern for all Western nations. However, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation (CAC) points out that it has extremely limited options when it comes to dropping nukes from the air. At best, it may be able to equip a plane with a nuke and hope to achieve a clean drop, but it's more likely that the plane will be shot out of the sky long before it delivered its payload. Beijing is trying to do something about this. The CAC reports that its development of the Zhan H-20 stealth bomber is likely to give it better nuclear capabilities from the skies, especially as its design is purposefully similar to the America's B-2 bomber. But that plane likely won't enter service until 2025 at the earliest, leaving China with no aerial nuclear threat until then. The US has that threat in abundance. Atomic Archive points out that the States has 2 bombers capable of launching nukes: the previously mentioned B-2A Spirit and the B-52H Stratofortress. What's more, it has 850 warheads, though not all being in commission, that it could launch from these planes. That stockpile is larger than the 350 total nukes that China is believed to have, which is already scary for Beijing. The fact that these bombs can be launched from the skies, likely out of the reach of any of China's anti-air defenses, is terrifying. Again, China is playing catch-up by trying to develop a bomber with similar capabilities. But until it has that and can manufacture at pace, the US will always hold the ultimate trump card if it somehow manages to lose in all other aspects on the aerial front. But based on what we've shared here, that isn't likely to happen. The US has more, better-trained pilots and far more aircraft than the PLAAF. It has superior tactics because it knows how to use its versatile fleet to conduct coordinated attacks designed to achieve air supremacy rather than simply support ground troops. Plus, thanks to the US having bases established in so many countries that surround China, it's far more capable of launching attacks over Chinese airspace than Beijing is over America's territory. And even if all of that superiority fails to deliver an aerial victory for the US, it can always press the big red button and launch nukes from the sky to devastate China. It's no wonder that China is running scared. The only worry for the US Air Force is that China is trying to run toward it rather than away. With all of its investment into military modernization, coupled with Beijing's willingness to spend big to attract pilots, we may see China becoming a stronger aerial force in years to come. But what do you think? Is China right to be terrified of America's aerial capabilities? Or does it have some way to mitigate them that we haven't explored here? As always, tell us what you think in the comments section. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.
What do Ukraine and China have in common? Let's start with geopolitical significance. Both China and Ukraine hold strategic geopolitical importance. China is the world's most populous country, with a population of approximately 1,426,000,000 in 2023, and the second largest economy, preceded by the US. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the second largest country in Europe by land area, with a total area of approximately 232,900 square miles. This means that the second largest country in Europe is roughly 28 times smaller than Europe's largest country, Russia, which spans an area of roughly 6,606,000 square miles. Then there's the fact that both China and Ukraine are connected through China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. making Ukraine an important transit country for the BRI's land-based routes, and thus linking China with Europe. However, lately, a new and deeply disturbing commonality has arisen between both countries: Putin's war on Ukraine. And as bad as it's been for Ukraine itself, it has also been downright disastrous for China. But why? In what way? Let's find out. In today's world, it pays to have friends in high places. Fortunately for the Western world, and especially Ukraine, Russia has virtually none of them. China, however, is among the few. The two neighbor nations are strategic partners, linked economically by $190 billion of annual trade, and politically by virtue of their authoritarian, like-minded leaders. Over the past decades, the two countries have forged closer bilateral ties. Both sides, moreover, view the United States as a hostile actor bent on containing their territorial and cultural ambitions. On the surface, they're like two geopolitical peas in a pod. But all is not as rosy as it seems. Once aspirational partners of Western democracies content, even keen to assimilate these two Eurasian powers into their economic, cultural, and political spheres, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. Russia's once vaunted military has, in many circles, become a laughingstock, and this has reflected poorly on China, whose own extraterritorial designs on its neighbors are well known throughout the world. Most peace-loving nations today view both as a threat, though certainly not on equal levels. One US official perhaps summarized it best: Russia is a hurricane. It comes on hard and fast. China, on the other hand, is climate change. Long, slow, pervasive. Today, China continues to foster close relations with Putin, even though the Russian president headlines the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant list. It's a bad look, but the PRC isn't willing to throw the Kremlin out with the bathwater just yet. Today, we'll discuss why they might want to reconsider that decision, and just how Russia's reverses in Ukraine may influence China's strategic calculus moving forward. Putin's illegal war has been an eye-opening experience for the world. China, as we all know, harbors territorial claims on Taiwan, its independent island neighbor. As such, the United States, Taiwan, and the vast majority of the civilized world place China's ambitions in the same category as Putin's toward Ukraine. Ever since Russian forces stormed across the border in February 2022, the United States and its allies kept a closer eye on China. If the Ukrainian invasion went as well as many thought it would be fair to assume China might feel empowered to attack Taiwan, especially as Europe and the US were distracted by Russia. We can safely say now, over a year in, and knowing what he knows about the complexities of modern joint and combined arms warfare, Xi would have to be stupid to authorize an unprovoked amphibious invasion of Taiwan. So far, there's only one dictator dumb enough to do that, and look how that's going. With each passing day, the PRC is witnessing Russia sink unfathomable amounts of blood and treasure into an almost unwinnable war of attrition. In the wreckage of Bakhmut, the atrocities of Bucha, and the discontent growing in the hearts of babushkas far and wide, China's leadership sees its future plans of easily seizing Taiwan slipping away. War is a hard teacher. For now, China may be content to sit back and learn all it can, while it can. Why then has Putin's invasion become a disaster for China's future plans? Let's dive in. No matter how you cut it, almost every lesson in Ukraine spells bad news for China. So far, China has adopted a unique, long-term, over-the-horizon strategic approach in its posture towards Taiwan. Its primary tactic has not been as in-your-face as you would expect from a rising superpower accustomed to throwing its economic and cultural weight around. But militarily, China has adapted something called gray zone operations to achieve its strategic ends. Gray zone operations are just like they sound, actions on the spectrum between peace and war. These small, compounding confrontations are not designed to escalate into a full-scale war, but they certainly can. They tend to be employed by powerful actors bent on achieving objectives that ordinarily might be illegal or too difficult to do all at once, and often take a variety of forms. These can include cyber attacks or covert espionage, political propaganda and misinformation campaigns, election rigging, economic warfare and sanctions, proxy wars, and the funding of destabilizing insurgencies, or the gradual weakening of alliances and partnerships. One of China's preferred tactics is to slowly increase the number of times it flies into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the internationally recognized airspace around the island, until it almost becomes normal. Along with this, China has recently sent more and more vessels up to and even over the Taiwan Strait median line, demarcating the boundary between both countries. It has deployed men and material onto smaller island chains, man-made and otherwise, in the South China Sea to intimidate and pressure their neighbor. It harasses foreign vessels traversing these waters too, as a Chinese naval vessel recently did to a Philippine Coast Guard patrol, just 105 miles off its own coastline. Grey zone operations take place independent from one another, on different days, at different times, just infrequently enough for the world to forget about them in our 24-hour news cycle. It's pretty smart. If China did everything at once, the world would label it as even more of a belligerent and untrustworthy actor than it already does. Collectively, these acts normalize displays of Chinese power, chip away at Taiwan's defensive resolve, condition the West into accepting higher levels of belligerency, and set China up for its ultimate aim. For anyone paying attention, the world has seen this type of behavior before. Vladimir Putin utilized grey zone tactics prior to and during its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, dispatching mercenaries and Russian forces in anonymous green uniforms with no markings to do his bidding, destabilizing the local government and paving the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. Putin told everyone he had no idea who these little green men were, as if. Their disguise as local pro-Russian separatists enabled Putin to claim plausible deniability for their involvement, giving him the ability to achieve his geopolitical aim without officially escalating the crisis into an unwinnable war. That didn't last long. Despite the Kremlin's reliance on grey zone operations, it ultimately could not get everything it wanted without a bigger, pre-planned invasion. And here, China will have certainly taken note. Before 2022, the West could only respond to what seemed a measured, limited invasion with measured, limited sanctions. China can and does expect the same when it pulls similar stunts in the South China Sea. The United States, as yet, hasn't been able to do much to challenge China's construction of artificial islands or its repeated violation of Taiwanese airspace, since it is short of a pronounced, conventional invasion. China can harass and weaken Taiwan in limited ways and still not be seen as overt aggressors. The West can apply economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, but China has weathered this type of response for decades now. Russia's switch from grey zone tactics to full-blown warfare has given China insight into the West's response, and it probably doesn't like what it has seen. The world rallied behind Ukraine, pouring billions of dollars worth of arms and aid into the fight. Its alliances grew stronger, its commitment to defending vulnerable nations, even indirectly, more firm. China now knows what it can expect in a similar Taiwan contingency. If they had plans to invade in the near future, they have probably shelved them for now, and rightly so. Just another reason why Putin's war has not only benefited the West, but also deterred China in the East. There are other lessons to be taken from Russia's invasion. Chief among them, China has learned that size isn't everything. China's military is excellent on paper. It has 2 million active soldiers, 500,000 more than the US. It recently launched its third aircraft carrier, which, compared to anyone besides the US, is a decent number, and now boasts the largest navy in the world by pure numbers. Its defense budget is surpassed only by the US. It has some of the world's best air-to-air hypersonic missiles and attack drones. But China sees that Russia too once boasted similar stats. From Ukraine, China has learned that material and numerical superiority doesn't automatically translate to victory. If it wants to successfully invade Taiwan, it will need far, far more. Russia had by far the more achievable territorial ambitions when it invaded Ukraine compared to China's designs on Taiwan. It had amassed so many tanks and mechanized infantry on Ukraine's border, it was easy to assume, and most did, that Kyiv would quickly capitulate. The countries are right next to each other. Russia had excellent railway access into the country. Save a few key waterways, Ukraine lacks natural defensive features. Russia even had a friendly partner in Belarus, whose territory it used to stage its attack. China would have to surmount a logistical Mount Everest if it commits to a similar invasion plan in Taiwan. Amphibious operations are among the most difficult to pull off, combining the intricacies of air, land, and sea warfare and the logistical challenge of transporting vehicles, men, and weapons across open water to contested shores. China has to cross the 100-mile-wide Strait of Taiwan first and foremost, a span in which it will be vulnerable to barrages of artillery and anti-ship missiles. If the fate of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, is any indication, modern anti-ship missiles can in fact exercise a massively disproportionate influence over the battlefield. When it gets onto the island of Taiwan, assuming it can actually establish a beachhead, it will have to establish and sustain huge stockpiles of supplies shipped over in secure convoys, defend itself from what will undoubtedly be an onslaught of Taiwanese artillery, and withstand any counterattacks that come. Superior numbers may not be enough to win out. Ultimately, the outcome of Russia's invasion is bad news for China for this one simple reason. You cannot intimidate your way to victory in war, especially when the enemy you fight has the moral high ground. Resistance will be fierce and pronounced. Taiwan will not give up simply because China outnumbers them. China has learned other lessons from Ukraine, among them the importance of training in the outcome of military engagements. Just as material superiority won't automatically translate to victory, armies will always struggle to overcome deficiencies in training. It is an indisputable fact that Ukrainian troops are far better trained than their Russian counterparts, mercenary, conscript, or otherwise. Most of Russia's most experienced, best-trained troops, commanders and non-commissioned officers are now dead, and Putin's repeated mobilization efforts have starkly revealed the deficiencies in Russian military training, whether the alarming lack of weapons, vehicles, and live ammunition to train on, unsuitable training sites, poor leadership, a chronic lack of technological enablers, or concern for the general well-being and training up of cohesive collective units. On the other hand, Ukraine has integrated a vast spectrum of foreign munitions, weapons, drones, and technology, eschewing older Soviet models and tactics for more effective Western ones. And that, in tandem with the intelligence they receive on a daily basis, has helped deliver several stunning victories. But while we often talk about the technology behind Ukraine's success, it's certainly no silver bullet. Western weapons are hard to maintain, at least in Ukraine, being both subject to breakdown and difficult to replace when stocks run low. In this discussion, we tend to forget the human element, how hard it is to deploy and use modern weapons effectively. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, Western systems that take a real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. As early as 1993, Ukrainian armed forces were training in the US through the United States National Guard's State Partnership Program, learning to deliver mission-type orders, empower Ukrainian soldiers to make on-the-fly battlefield decisions, and using realistic combat exercises to hone the skills and wartime resilience of Ukrainian personnel. More recently, tens of thousands of Ukrainian officers have received crash courses in modern joint war fighting in Britain, Germany, Poland, and as part of the US Army Europe's Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, a blended task force of Americans, Poles, Lithuanians, Brits, Canadians, and other soldiers established in 2015 to mentor and advise Ukrainian battalions in the art of combined arms warfare. These train-the-trainer programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. The bad news for China is that Taiwan joined a similar US-led program in 2022 and have been integrating Western-built weapon systems far longer than that. Every day that goes by, their military will glean lessons from the best forces in the world, making an invasion that much harder to pull off. Speaking of lessons, it is a well-known fact that Russia underestimated the extent to which Ukraine would receive Western assistance after it was invaded, and China now knows that even if the United States, its allies and partners do not expressly commit hard military power to fight side by side with Taiwanese forces in the event of an invasion, it can be sure that the likelihood the Western world will assist Taiwan in some way is extremely high. Geographic distance from an international hotspot no longer hinders the degree of foreign aid or the level of intervention in the way it once did. Even though a vast Pacific expanse separates Taiwan from the United States, it would still send crucial military and humanitarian aid if China invades. Witnessing the astronomical sums of money donated by NATO member countries to Ukraine will send shivers down Xi Jinping's spine. Thanks to Russia, the West is once more alert to the tangible threat of authoritarianism. Gone are the days of ambivalence or neutrality when it comes to ensuring territorial integrity. China's hopes of the United States staying aloof from a Taiwanese confrontation are long gone. The US has proven willing to send state-of-the-art tanks, high-tech weapons, and advisors to help Ukraine, currently facing its second most pronounced national security threat. We predict it will offer the same assistance, if not more, to Taiwan. This leads to another reason why Russia's experience should send warning signals to China. Just as it has drawn insight from the West's reaction to Russia's invasion, it must recognize that the West, too, has been learning what works and what doesn't when countries threaten to invade their neighbor. China may have taken some confidence from the initial response to Russia's decision to amass troops on Ukraine's border. The West could only threaten to proportionately punish Russian aggression in the vaguest terms, since technically it was all still hypothetical. The threat and implementation of economic sanctions was serious, but far from insurmountable. Russia had hoped to win the war quickly and incorporate Ukraine's vast resources and manpower, thus shielding itself from the worst effects of sanctions. Yes, they might temporarily make average Russians uncomfortable in the short term. The long-term strategic benefits of a rapid, decisive victory, however, couldn't be ignored. Once the war was over and Russia controlled Ukraine, it's fair to say that Russia might be able to slowly reduce the impact of sanctions and re-engage in dialogue with the West, as it had after it invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. In a perfect world, China foresees a similar outcome for its own invasion. But Russian setbacks have shown that once the war spirals out of control and the aggressor finds itself on the losing side, the West will move from mere sanctions to deterrence through denial, deploying rapid response troops to the region to prevent things from escalating further as a preventative measure. Because the threat of sanctions was not enough to stop Russia from invading, and when they were implemented they did not alter Russia's behavior to the extent many had hoped, it is possible the West will simply double down on not only arming Taiwan with the weapons and training it needs ahead of time, but redoubling its own presence. This is what Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific nations have already been doing for months now. You can be sure China would much rather deal with sanctions than the latter. Another takeaway is actually a corollary to the idea that the West will go beyond the threat of sanctions. It is the idea that even if sanctions are slow, they do eventually work. China is in an entirely different weight class economically than Russia. US and European officials are well aware that the potential implications of sanctions on China is a far more complex exercise than sanctions on Russia, given US and allies' extensive entanglement with the Chinese economy. At least that is according to Nazak Nikaktar, a former senior US Commerce Department official. China has the world's second largest economy and a massive global supply chain. The war would not only harm them, but the West, which relies on China for countless goods, from shoes to surfboards and cell phones to computers. But if the West is able to target specific corners of China's economy, for example its reliance on foreign-made microchips and telecommunications equipment, it could limit its ability to pursue a long-term military operation. This is what is happening to Russia, who can barely get the specialized parts and resources it needs to maintain its aging arsenal of tanks, missiles, and other weapons. It took close to a year for Western sanctions to show results, but it is happening. It has forced Russian leadership to look to Iran, North Korea, and even China for relief. It certainly makes Chinese leaders wonder if invading Taiwan would be worth the disastrous economic consequences if it were suddenly shut off from Western goods and resources or sell its own wares in foreign markets, the bread and butter upon which it has built itself into a regional superpower. Any invasion is likely to cement sanctions in place for years, and China now has every indication that the West would be willing to sustain these for the long haul, even if it adversely affected their own economies. The invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call to the US and the rest of NATO. For 30 years, it felt confident that the threat of authoritarianism and conventional peer aggression were relics of the past. A false sense of security lulled the West into believing it could retrench its security commitments and focus inward on themselves. In the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, there were serious, high-level discussions regarding the United States' forward presence in Europe and how far it should go to underwrite European security. It has the most powerful military on Earth. It is the backbone of NATO. If the US had to fight alone, it could certainly defeat any other country in an equal fight. But Putin's invasion reminded American policymakers how valuable multinational security collaboration can be. It highlighted the pitfalls of drawing red lines in the sand and not being willing to back them up. Now, the US and its allies are clearer about how active they will be in supporting their allies and partners. Unfortunately for China, Taiwan is one such place, and it has Putin to thank for the reaffirmation of American political, economic, and military support for the island. Had Putin never invaded, it's fair to assume that the United States may have drifted into ambivalence. With each presidential term, costs of projecting preventative power into the Pacific would continue to mount, causing debate over whether it was all worth it. Who knows, over time the US may have actually withdrawn many of its forces and shuttered its overseas bases, opening a window for China's grey zone operations to come to full effect. Now, there's little chance China will get away with this type of behavior without serious repercussions. The US will keep a closer eye on China to ensure it doesn't try to mobilize an invasion force. If it does, it should take heed of one final lesson from Russia. If an invasion goes wrong, you can kiss your power and influence goodbye. Today, almost everyone across the globe, besides Russia itself, knows Putin's military is nowhere near as powerful as he made it out to be. Invading an independent, freedom-loving neighbor is a perfect way to turn the entire world against you. Failed invasions are tickets to infamy. They are permanent marks of discredit, disgrace, and disrepute. Russia has long since lost control of the narrative of benign liberation it touted as its primary aim. NATO has become more united and emboldened, and all from a failed invasion. If China launched its own invasion and failed, it would undoubtedly witness its hard-earned influence and prestige throughout East Asia and even beyond fade away. America's closest regional allies in the Indo-Pacific remain closely tied to China in some form or another. But if China invaded and embarked on a long, drawn-out war, it would see its regional influence shrink relative to its enemies. Just because a country is a major power does not mean the world can't live without it. Just ask Putin. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been an unmitigated disaster for China. The powerful Eurasian alliance it once hoped to forge with its Russian ally is now severely unbalanced. The world is a completely different place than it was a year ago. Just as the West has wised up to authoritarian threats, China has learned that an invasion would be met with stout Taiwanese resistance and long-term Western support. Power on paper does not guarantee success. But what do you think? Will China decide to invade Taiwan despite the obvious risks? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
If the nightmare scenario of World War III were to become reality, where would the hostilities break out? Could it come near the shores of the Baltic Sea, with Russia trying to regain some of its prestige in the region after an embarrassing performance in Ukraine? Could it be in the Middle East with a renewed Iranian nuclear program? Or perhaps it could come from renewed hostilities on the Korean peninsula, which is still technically in a state of war. Or maybe China decides to risk everything on an invasion of Taiwan. These are all potential hotspots, but the likeliest one could be in the South China Sea, where China has expanded its military presence for a decade and alienated all of its neighbors in the region, who also claim these waters and their islands. Could World War III break out in the South China Sea? If so, why? Let's take a look at the importance of this region, the basis of China's territorial ambitions in it, and how likely a confrontation might actually be. The South China Sea, which stretches from the Strait of Malacca in the west to the Strait of Taiwan in the east, is a rich target for any would-be great power to exploit. It is abundant in resources. There are at least 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in these islands and waterways. The South China Sea is also home to some of the world's richest fisheries, providing about 15% of the world's total fishing potential. Rare earth metals such as yttrium, which are so vital to the modern digital economy, can also be found in the South China Sea. In addition to its natural resources, the area is one of the most vital crossroads of world trade. As of 2021, about $5.3 trillion, about 22% of annual global trade, passed through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, including 40% of the world's petroleum products, 60% of its maritime trade, and a third of the world's total shipping. Some of the world's biggest economies depend on this trade too. For example, 42% of Japan's total trade comes through this region. This is a rich prize for any aspiring superpower. When considering why China wants the South China Sea so badly, it is also important to note that it is a food insecure nation. It depends heavily on foreign food imports. In 2017, China imported $104.5 billion worth of food and exported only about $60 billion. In terms of grain production, Chinese agriculture has achieved a 1-to-1 production to consumption ratio. However, it lags behind its rivals like the United States and Australia, which produce 1.4 times more grain than they consume. Additionally, China's economic growth has created a large middle class, with more sophisticated food demands, such as meat and dairy, which are more resource-intensive. It needs to import from foreign sources to fulfill the demands of its population. It does not help that China has a relatively low amount of arable land at 0.21 acres per capita. Environmental damage from decades of communist mismanagement makes matters worse. 15.5% of China's groundwater is so polluted that it cannot be used in any setting, and widespread soil contamination has destroyed millions of acres of otherwise arable land, especially in the country's southern provinces. Meanwhile, over 1 million Chinese hogs were slaughtered to contain the spread of African swine fever, and domestic pork production fell by 21.3% in 2019. Meanwhile, pork imports from the United States increased by 258%. To make matters worse for Beijing, even though China is the world's largest producer and exporter of fish, it is also still the world's third largest fish importer, and Chinese fisheries have been stressed by overfishing. In 2013, the Chinese leadership acknowledged that the country would require moderate imports of food to meet its consumption needs. In this light, it is not surprising that China would want to increase its food security. Seizing the fisheries in the South China Sea is only the most obvious method of expansion of its food production capacity. Controlling the shipping that is so vital to its food supply is a no-brainer for Beijing. China also became the world's biggest energy consumer in 2010. In 2013, China became the world's largest net importer of crude oil, and its energy demands have only grown in the decade since. It must remain able to access the South China Sea's shipping lanes to ensure this energy supply. Bottom line, whoever controls the South China Sea also controls its resources and the economies of the nations that rely on the shipping that goes through its waters. It is therefore not surprising that China made moves to expand its influence in the region when its military became more capable. How has China justified these moves? Beijing cites historical reasons. Its modern claims on 90% of the South China Sea's waterways are based on the so-called 9-dash line map. The map originated in 1947 when, in the aftermath of World War II, a Chinese cartographer named Yang Huairen drew a map of 11 dashes, which extended from the waters east of Taiwan through the South China Sea almost to Malaysia and up the Vietnamese coastline all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin. This map was drawn under the nationalist government which ruled the then Republic of China. 2 years later, the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, overthrew the nationalists and took control of the Chinese mainland. Mao subsequently redrew the map to 9 dashes and abandoned the claim on the Gulf of Tonkin, but the basic scheme remained intact. China tries to justify the 9-dash line's legitimacy on historical grounds. It claims that it was the great power in the area and had run the waters before it suffered from unjust imperialism at the hands of the Western powers and Japan in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Records of Chinese control and development of the Spratly Islands in particular supposedly stretch back to the 2nd century BC. More concrete Chinese claims come from the Cairo and Potsdam declarations during and after World War II. These supposedly had China reclaiming sovereignty in the South China Sea's islands. The formal peace treaty with Japan in 1951 and the San Francisco Conference Statement in 1958 also had China reiterating that the South China Sea territory was its own. However, these claims were and are regarded as unfounded by the international community. The dispute in the South China Sea therefore gives credence to the realist theory of international relations, where self-interested states compete with one another in an anarchical environment. China's claim on the area are unrecognized, so it is asserting itself by force and daring anyone to try and stop its ambitions. After all, there is no policeman to call on in an international setting and no court of law with any real power beyond what states themselves give it, as we will soon see. The 11 and 9- line maps were of little consequence in the first few decades after they were drawn. China had suffered from nearly 150 years of invasion, civil war, and the famines and purges Mao imposed with the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. China was therefore in no position to enforce the claims of its 9- line. However, Beijing indicated early on that it was willing to use force to back up its otherwise spurious claims. In 1974, China seized control of the Paracel Islands from the then existing country of South Vietnam, killing more than 70 South Vietnamese troops in the process. The following year, the Vietnam War ended, and the country reunified under the North's rule, and the North inherited the claim to the Paracels, which it disputes with China to this day. The Paracels are relatively close to the Hainan Island, which is officially recognized Chinese territory. But as China got economically and militarily stronger after Mao's death in 1976, it got bolder in enforcing its claims further afield. In 1988, China and Vietnam fought in the Spratlys, and Vietnam again got the worst of the engagement, suffering the loss of 60 sailors and 3 ships. China also fought with the Philippines in the Mischief Reef incident of 1996, where 3 ships from the Chinese Navy fought a 90-minute battle with a Filipino gunboat in the Spratly Islands. However, China's modern posture in the South China Sea dates to 2012, when it unilaterally seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a territory in the Philippines recognized exclusive economic zone. Standoffs and warning shots between China and the Philippines had occurred in 2011, but the situation escalated dramatically in April 2012. On the 8th, a Filipino Navy surveillance plane spotted 8 Chinese fishing boats in the Scarborough Shoal. On the 11th, the Filipino Navy had a standoff with China's Navy. China eventually won this contest when, on July 18th, it blocked Filipino ships and fishing boats from entering the Scarborough Shoals lagoon. It has effectively administered the area ever since. The Philippines took China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2013, and in 2016, the court ruled in the former's favor, dismissing any claim that China had over the territory in the South China Sea and invalidating the 9- line entirely. Did this stop China from advancing its claims in the area? You know the answer to that. Beijing's attitude was that the court made its ruling, good luck in enforcing it. China not only disregarded the international court's ruling, but it accelerated its plans to dominate the South China Sea. From 2013 to 15, it began building artificial islands in its positions in the Spratly Islands. It soon began militarizing these areas. In March 2022, US Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral John C. Aquilino announced that China had fully militarized at least 3 of the islands it had built several years earlier. These islands were Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. The new fortresses boasted airfields with fighter jets and which were even capable of hosting bombers. The islands also housed anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile systems. Laser and jamming equipment were also features in these islands. The military buildup came partially in response to the United States Freedom of Navigation Operations (FONOPs) in the area. These operations and China's response to them pose one of the biggest risks for war. In 2022, Aquilino was in the thick of the action. He spoke with the Associated Press reporters on a US Navy reconnaissance plane, a P-8A Poseidon. that flew close to the Chinese island fortresses. Chinese military personnel contacted the plane and warned it to leave. China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, as well as surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment. The American pilot responded like so: "I am a sovereign, immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state. Exercising these rights is guaranteed by international law, and I am operating with due regard to the rights and duties of all states." The implication was obvious. China claims that the islands it built are its territory and that it has the right to defend them. The United States says that they are not, and proceed under the assumption that they are not. Maintaining freedom of trade and navigation on the world's waterways has long been one of the United States military's primary missions. To maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and deter China from growing even more aggressive there, the United States has conducted its FONOPs since 2015. These operations can take one of two forms. In the first form, they may simply be transit exercises. In the second, they may be explicit military exercises. The United States does not notify or seek China's approval when it conducts these operations within its supposed 9-line territory. In other words, the FONOPs are a direct challenge to China's claimed sovereignty in the South China Sea, showing that the United States regards these claims as nothing more than illegitimate bluster on the part of Beijing. This is a game of brinksmanship. Who will blink first? So far, it's been China, but there is no guarantee that that will continue forever. In its first FONOP on October 27, 2015, the destroyer USS Lassen came within 12 nautical miles of features in the Spratly Islands claimed by China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Although the FONOP was technically designed to counter all of these expansive territorial claims, everybody understood who the real recipient of the message was supposed to be. Similar operations have taken place since then, and they have increased as the years have gone by. The Chinese Navy soon challenged America's FONOPs, and there have been numerous close calls. In 2018, there was a near collision between a US Navy destroyer and a Chinese warship when the latter tried to block the American vessel's path. This close call was avoided, but Chinese naval ships have become more aggressive in tailing and disputing the US Navy as it sails past what they claim are Chinese territorial waters and islands. The risk for escalation increases when one considers that ship captains have a relatively high degree of autonomy. For example, equipment failure might make a captain feel like his vessel is under threat. Faulty communications, equipment, or radars could present an incomplete picture of events, giving the ship's captain what he believes are limited options to protect the vessel and its crew. In such confusion, human nature tends to default to assuming the worst. There is precedent for a close call between the US and Chinese armed forces. In April 2001, an American reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter and was forced to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island. China detained the plane's crew for 11 days as Washington and Beijing blamed each other for the incident and disagreed over the terms of a resolution. Both sides tried to be accommodating, and the incident was resolved without too much controversy in the end, to the point that it's nearly forgotten today. If a similar incident occurred now, the story could be very different. Understandably, this prospect makes military and foreign policy experts nervous. Some have called for an end to the US military's FONOPs in the South China Sea, arguing that they have failed and that the risks exceed the benefits. They argue that the cost of upholding international norms through military means has increased to a level that is too high, and that the American public would not be willing to pay. Instead, these experts argue that the United States should use economic leverage to force China to change its behavior. There is recent precedent for this. In 2020, the United States Commerce Department sanctioned 24 Chinese companies for their behavior in the South China Sea, prohibiting the sale of certain exported goods. The State Department joined in the effort and announced that individuals in those companies would also be prohibited from obtaining visas to enter the United States. However, there are severe limits to this approach. Most of the companies in question did not source any of their materials from the United States, and the visa restrictions are altogether toothless. It's hard to conclude that completely ceding the military realm in the South China Sea to China's much less capable neighbors will encourage Beijing to alter its expansionist policy in the region. To add to these diplomatic and military tensions, there are also matters of national and cultural pride among the South China Sea's disputants. The 9-dash line has become a matter of national pride among the Chinese public over the last decade. To them, it is a sign that the period of humiliation, poverty, and revolution are over, and that China is at last retaking its rightful place at the hegemon of Asia. For China's neighbors, the issue is similarly sensitive. In the summer of 2023, Vietnam banned Barbie from its movie theaters over a scene with a map in the background that supposedly depicted China's 9-dash line. Vietnam and the Philippines banned the movie Uncharted in 2022 for the same reason. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia banned the 2019 movie Abominable, again for the same reason. For these countries, which also claim the South China Sea but do not have the military means to back up their assertions, sensitivity about their disadvantage is naturally elevated. With national pride on the line, there are additional emotional stakes in the South China Sea conflict. The United States, which is approaching the dispute from strategic and economic perspectives, will need to take such cultural considerations into account as it makes its policy there to counter China's hegemonic ambitions. The United States is keen to make alliances with other countries in the area to prevent China from taking control of the South China Sea's shipping lanes. This strategy began with the reinvigoration of the quadrilateral security dialogue during the Trump years. The United States and its Quad partners, Australia, Japan, and India, committed to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. China has repeatedly protested the Quad and considers it a threat. Meanwhile, the United States has renewed its long-standing military ties with the Philippines and is building new army, air, and naval bases in that country. This is bad news for China, which was hoping to court the Philippines into its orbit. Despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Rodrigo Duterte, who was president of the Philippines from 2016 to 22, maintained a friendlier policy toward China, in hopes of making his country less dependent on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has reversed this policy and allowed the US military a greater presence in the Philippines. The United States has also been steadily improving its bilateral relations with Vietnam. Although there are no formal military ties between the two countries yet, that could change in the future as China continues to get more aggressive with its claims in the area. The United States has not taken the side of the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, or any other power in the area with excessive maritime claims. Indeed, it does not support any of these and seeks to maintain freedom of navigation in the area. However, none of these countries have the ability to shut such navigation down. China does, and containing its ambitions in the South China Sea is the common interest that they all share. In possibly the most famous part of his History of the Peloponnesian War, the Melian Dialogue, the Athenians told the city of Melos that they had two choices: submit or suffer the consequences. In contrast to the Melians' talk about what would amount to international law today, the Athenians responded only that they had an interest in Melos and would be acting accordingly. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. We have seen this ancient dynamic in play in the South China Sea, with China acting in a similar manner. With China unlikely to change its behavior anytime soon, and with the economic, geostrategic, and cultural stakes involved, it's far from a stretch to think that war could break out in this region. Perhaps an American FONOP goes very wrong, or perhaps China uses its bases in the region to launch a much greater offensive in disputed territories. However it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic, and an accident here is much more likely than an accident over Taiwan. But what do you think about the South China Sea dispute? Is it the place where World War III is likeliest to break out? Is there a way to resolve the matter peacefully? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The rise of an aggressive China under Xi Jinping has severely disrupted the post-Cold War international order. Xi aims for China to become the world's leading superpower by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in China's civil war. To achieve these goals, China has used its economic leverage to seduce or coerce other nations and multinational corporations to go along with its bidding. It has also expanded its military presence in the South China Sea and increased its saber-rattling against Taiwan, which it aims to incorporate back into the mainland's governance by 2049. China's behavior has caused great alarm among its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region, prompting the response of a new multilateral coalition, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But what is this organization, usually called the Quad? Why is it after China?
and what are its intentions to counter China's behavior? The Quad had its beginnings in December 2004, in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the 29th, then-President George W. Bush announced that the United States would partner with a regional core group of India, Japan, and Australia to coordinate relief efforts. The effort gave the group its first experience of conducting maritime operations together. The Quad got renewed impetus in the initial rise of Shinzo Abe as the Japanese Prime Minister. When campaigning for office in 2006, Abe described his vision of an arc of freedom and prosperity. The arc would be a grouping of like-minded states in the region making a collective effort to promote liberal values like free markets and the rule of law. In December 2006, then Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh announced his country's accession to the dialogue. When 2007 began, then American Vice President Dick Cheney signaled American interest and convinced then Australian Prime Minister John Howard to cooperate as well. Abe travelled to India that April, which paved the way for the Quad's first senior-level meeting the following month. The navies of the four countries then cooperated in the second Exercise Malabar alongside the Singaporean Navy. Despite this promising start, the Quad experienced troubles shortly thereafter. China always viewed it as a threat. At that time, it was not yet apparent that China would attempt to change the international status quo by coercive methods. There were still great hopes that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization in the country. Important potential partner countries like South Korea were therefore reluctant to join the Quad and risk alienating China. Meanwhile, India, traditionally a non-aligned country, saw public protests over its participation in the Malabar exercise. China's diplomatic efforts helped to lead to the unraveling of the Quad and Shinzo Abe's fall from power in September 2007, depriving it of its leading advocate. By the beginning of 2008, the Quad had collapsed. A decade later, things had changed dramatically. China became more authoritarian at home and confrontational abroad under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012. At the same time, Shinzo Abe returned to power in Japan, and just one day after his second premiership began, he signaled his geopolitical intentions. Peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Japan, as one of the oldest seafaring democracies in Asia, should play a greater role, alongside Australia, India, and the US, in preserving the common good in both regions. This statement was the prototype of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific (FOIP) strategy. Abe's policy was to insert a reinvigorated Japanese military into traditional bilateral and trilateral exercises between the United States, India, and Australia. For example, the United States and India continued to do their traditional bilateral Malabar naval exercises, but Japan became a permanent party to these in 2015. As Abe worked to slowly reconstruct the Quad, China became more confrontational with all of its participating countries. Disputes ratcheted up between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands, which the former administers but the latter claims as its territory. India and China had numerous border standoffs. Australian politicians were found to have accepted money from China-aligned organizations and individuals, which helped to lead new foreign interference laws in that country in 2018. The rise of Donald Trump to the White House in 2016 also spurred the reformation of the Quad. Trump had long been of the belief that China was the greatest threat to the United States, which made him agreeable to the idea of the Quad. An October 2017 meeting between then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono resulted in them proposing a resumption of the full Quad. The following month at the ASEAN conference in Manila, representatives from the four countries met on the margins to discuss the tense situation in the Indo-Pacific region. All four affirmed their support for the FOIP concept. Quadrilateral meetings on the issue have continued ever since. In the 2000s, after its revival, China has often complained that the Quad is an attempt to create an Asian NATO to contain it. However, the Quad is not a formal alliance, unlike NATO. It's rather an informal grouping of countries. In a statement that laid out the spirit of the Quad, in 2021, the group's leaders said, "We bring diverse perspectives and are united in a shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion." While not declaring a formal alliance, the statement left little room for doubt that China was the main source of concern among the Quad's members. As such, the Quad is first and foremost a security cooperative, as its proper name suggests.
Joint security cooperation has been an integral feature of the Quad since its refounding. Australia was added to the annual Malabar exercises in 2020 and has repeated its presence there since. Quad countries are also increasing their bilateral and trilateral security ties. Japan and India engage in regular JIMEX exercises in the North Arabian Sea, while India and Australia have their bilateral OSINDEX exercise. All Quad countries are participants in the multilateral Rim of Pacific (RIMPAC) exercises. The United States, which is a long-time ally of both Japan and Australia, conducts regular military cross-training with both of those countries. Japan's goals for the Quad are relatively simple. Ensure that China does not become the hegemon of Asia. If such a thing were to happen, its trade would be imperiled. Roughly 40% of Japan's imports come through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, and as a resource-poor nation, it needs those imports for its economic survival. Unfortunately for Tokyo, China has increasingly militarized and monopolized the area since 2012. If China is not deterred from further aggression, Beijing will be in a position to dictate the trade of the region, forcing Japan into a terrible geopolitical position. If China gets too powerful, Japan may also lose control of the Senkaku Islands, just as the Philippines lost control of the Scarborough Shoal. The alliance with the United States has traditionally been, and remains, the foundation of Japan's national security. But Australia and India are valuable partners that it cannot do without in light of the higher stakes. Japan has therefore deepened its security ties with Australia. The two countries made a reciprocal forces agreement to formalize procedures for overseas troop deployments. In 2023, Japan announced it would be stationing troops in Australia, which is a deviation from decades of traditional military policy in Tokyo. Japan has also made an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with India, along with defense equipment, technology, and intelligence sharing agreements. For Australia, the Quad is a reinforcement and leveling up of its traditional diplomatic relationships. For example, Australia has long been a partner in the Five Eyes intelligence alliance with the United States. Australia's military cooperation with Japan has increased, and in June 2020, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison signaled a mutual logistics sharing agreement with India, while announcing that their bilateral institutions would now be considered as a comprehensive strategic partnership. Moreover, China's recent security pact with the Solomon Islands, which sit to the northeast of Australia, threatens its trade. Australia needs a counterweight, which it sees the Quad as being. The Quad has also allowed Australia to become more militarily capable, as the AUKUS pact with the United States and the United Kingdom will give it nuclear submarines, which Beijing loudly complained about. For India, the Quad represents a departure from its traditional policy of strategic autonomy in foreign affairs. Unlike the other three Quad members, it does not have experience participating in America's system of military alliances. Still, India needs partners, if not allies, to prevent China from getting too powerful. India and China share a disputed border. China's navy has increased its presence in India's backyard. China is also an important partner for India's traditional enemy, Pakistan. China's economic partnerships with India's neighbors through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Comprehensive Economic Partnership threaten to isolate India from the region. In light of this reality, India has had little choice but to increase its ties with the United States. New Delhi has increased its security ties with Washington through military purchases that include anti-submarine platforms and heavy-lift aircraft. India has also signed logistics and base access agreements with Australia and Japan. For the United States, keeping China's power in check and preventing it from becoming a regional hegemon is now the top foreign policy priority. For Washington, the Quad is a valuable institution to assist America in achieving this goal. The United States has global commitments, which Russia's invasion of Ukraine made all too clear. In a direct confrontation between the United States and China, the latter would be able to concentrate all of its resources in the conflict, while America's forces would be divided. Washington has long sought to put a greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, but despite this being a rare area of bipartisan consensus, it's never been able to do so to the extent that it has wanted. NATO's free rider problem and Middle Eastern flare-ups are only two examples of things which divide the attention of the United States and force it to spread its resources more thinly. The Quad therefore is a means for Washington to both put greater emphasis on the strategic region and build up forces and relationships to assist in containing Beijing's ambitions. Through the security cooperation of the Quad, the United States is steadily improving the military readiness of Japan, India, and Australia. The Quad also allows for the rapid cooperation of America's partners to threaten Chinese shipping.
For example, India can easily threaten to choke Chinese shipping off from the Strait of Malacca, while Japan can do the same for the Strait of Miyako. As China relies heavily on foreign food and fuel imports, this is an important measure of geostrategic leverage to force China to change its behavior. America's Quad partners are strategically positioned to the east, west, and south of the First Island chain, multiplying the United States' ability to contain China's ambitions in the region. For these reasons, China was again quick to protest the Quad and denounce it as a method of containment, but the cooperating countries have cared far less about Beijing's protests in this second go of the security partnership. China's actions since the first incarnation of the Quad fell apart had alienated its neighbors in the region, as well as the United States. China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic only strengthened the conviction that China was a bad actor on the world stage. 2020 would be an important year in defining the Quad's purpose and giving it staying power. Shortly after the pandemic began, China got into a diplomatic row with Australia over the latter's insistence on an independent inquiry into its origins. China responded to these calls by imposing punitive tariffs on many Australian exports. Meanwhile, the border dispute between China and India saw an armed confrontation in June 2020, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian troops and 4 Chinese soldiers. The events of 2021 spurred the Quad to expand its purview. Despite the chaotic presidential election in the United States, Donald Trump's successor, Joe Biden, largely continued his administration's policies regarding China, including with the Quad. However, Biden soon signaled his intentions on expanding the Quad beyond a coalition to contain China. It was the first summit of Joe Biden's presidency, indicating the importance of this multilateral relationship to the new administration's foreign policy agenda. Under Joe Biden, the Quad has evolved beyond a purely military or security partnership. It has also been involved in economic and diplomatic aid. For example, the group's first summit, which took place in March 2021, outlined its plans to counter the COVID-19 pandemic by distributing 1 billion doses of the single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine to low- and middle-income countries in Southeast Asia by the end of 2022. The United States would finance the measure, Japan and India would manufacture the vaccines, and Australia would take the lead in distributing the shots and getting them into arms. It was the start of a broader purpose for the Quad, to tackle other global challenges such as cybercrimes, terrorism, and climate change. Although this would seem irrelevant as a strategic counter to China, it's not. China has sought to expand its influence through economic and diplomatic partnerships equally as much as it has attempted to with its military buildup. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of Xi Jinping's most important strategic initiatives, which is why it's not surprising that infrastructure has also been on the Quad's agenda. At the first in-person Quad summit in September 2021, the leaders announced that high-standards infrastructure would be a priority for the partnership. This announcement was an evolution of the trilateral infrastructure partnership already in place between the United States, Japan, and Australia. In May 2022, the Quad leaders announced the Quad Infrastructure Coordination Group, which would focus on transportation, digital connectivity, clean energy, and climate resilience. The statement released by the Biden White House said that the heads of the Quad's respective national development financing agencies had met in Tokyo to discuss the infrastructure financing gap in the region, a veiled shot at the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement stated that these agencies would cooperate with each other and the private sector to support investments in critical infrastructure. The same White House press release also announced that space and emerging technologies would continue to be a focus for the Quad. The subjects range from 5G supplier diversification to space observation, satellite data sharing, and disaster response and relief for the Indo-Pacific region. In space, the Quad's focus is on observation and data exchanges for the moment, but the release also mentioned a focus on consulting on norms and guidelines. However, with China testing hypersonic glide vehicles, it seems likely that the Quad's security relationship will eventually expand to space. The Quad aims to foster ties between the people of respective member states as well. At their 2021 summit, the leaders announced the Quad Fellowship, which will sponsor 100 students per year, 25 from each country, to pursue STEM graduate degrees at elite universities in the United States with the cooperation of the private sector. While the dialogue is currently limited to 4 members, there have been discussions about expanding the Quad. Quad Plus meetings have included South Korea, New Zealand, and even Vietnam. South Korea has expressed interest in joining the organization formally, although this has not happened yet. Why? While tensions between the two have lessened since the election of Yoon Suk-yeol to the South Korean presidency in 2022, Seoul and Tokyo have long had frosty relations over historical, economic, and security issues. There is no guarantee that the gradual thawing in relations between South Korea and Japan will continue. Therefore, the Biden administration seems worried that a renewed stress between the two would undermine the Quad's cohesion, should South Korea formally join it. It's also arguable that formally including other countries in the core Quad would undermine the group's cohesion. Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. The current grouping allows rapid communication and decision-making among its members, and all four seem to want to keep it that way. On the other hand, the Quad cannot afford to remain too insular. Other like-minded countries, including countries in Europe, are expanding their Indo-Pacific strategies and their presence in the area. If the four Quad members do not engage in meaningful coordination with these efforts, they risk duplicating or undercutting each other's efforts in the region, according to a report written by Garima Mohan and Christy Govella for the German Marshall Fund, a security and democracy-focused think tank headquartered in Washington. Furthermore, to build a positive alternative to China's vision for the Indo-Pacific region that goes beyond the security sphere, the Quad will need to develop a reputation of delivering on its many pledges. Unfortunately for the Quad, there are already reasons to believe that it will not be able to do so. By May 2022, it was clear that the vaccine partnership had underperformed the lofty goals set for it. Delivery of the shots only began in early 2022, when the pandemic was already winding down. By May, the Quad had delivered less than half the vaccine doses it promised thanks to time, circumstances such as India's COVID-19 outbreak in the spring of 2021, and controversy over the selected Johnson & Johnson vaccine. By September 22, it became clear that the goal would not be met, and the Quad pivoted away from the vaccine pledge. Instead, the Quad's policy would shift to preparing for future emergencies, such as strengthening global healthcare architecture and prevention of future pandemics. The Quad has not always been smooth sailing in other ways too. The four members have been at odds at times. Unlike the other three Quad members, India has been far more ambiguous in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's purchased Russian energy at an increased rate, helping to keep Moscow's economy afloat. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also come under international controversy for his government's crackdown on the country's Muslim population in the Indian-controlled portion of the disputed Kashmir region. As the Quad pledges to be a bulwark of liberal values, some of Modi's policies may undermine its humanitarian image. However, these controversies have tended to take secondary status in the Quad, which remains a security-first grouping. In international relations, security considerations will always take priority over economic and ideological considerations. And with the Quad now being broadly popular among the electorates of all four member states, it's an institution with staying power, unlike the way it was the first time round. For all four members of the Quad, the security considerations are clear. China under Xi Jinping has inserted itself at the center of many of the world's critical supply chains, built up its armed forces, saber-rattled against its neighbors, expanded its influence over other nations with its Belt and Road infrastructure projects, and become more authoritarian. Preventing China from becoming strong enough to dictate terms in the region is a matter of survival for India, Australia, and Japan, and necessary if the United States wishes to remain the world's leading nation. The Quad may not be an Asian NATO, but its arrival has made many experts conclude that there is a new Cold War going on in the Indo-Pacific region. As NATO proved so important in containing the Soviet Union in the first Cold War, the Quad's advocates seek for it to do the same to China now. But what do you think about the Quad? What will its future be, and how will it shape the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The People's Republic of China has big plans. By 2049, it aims to displace the United States as the world's most powerful country, completing its 180-degree turnaround from an impoverished colossus suffering under a supposed century of humiliation. It is a poetic goal, fit for an epic story. There's a fundamental flaw in the story though, China's own geography, which effectively aids the United States' strategy to contain its ambitions. In this video, we'll explore the containment strategy and China's attempts to get around it. In the Cold War, the United States and its allies faced a big problem, literally. This was the European plain, which begins at the Bay of Biscay in France and extends for thousands of miles all the way to the Ural Mountains. The further east you go, the broader the plain gets, with the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies extending from the Urals all the way to central Germany. The United States and NATO's were outnumbered and forced onto a narrow front. There, the communist powers could concentrate all of their forces in an offensive drive to the west. For Washington, this geostrategic disadvantage meant that the only seemingly feasible means of containing communism in Europe was through nuclear deterrence. It was not the case in Asia. When the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949, the United States came up with its island chain strategy to keep the People's Republic and its Soviet ally bottled up in the Eurasian landmass. The strategy, formalized in 1951, was largely the brainchild of John Foster Dulles, then an advisor to President Truman and later Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. Originally, the island chain strategy comprised 3 strings, essentially 3 lines of defense against communism in the Pacific. These lines remain in place today. The first island chain stretches from the Japanese archipelago down to Taiwan, through the Philippines, and finally into the Indonesian archipelago, stopping at the Strait of Malacca. The second island chain also starts from Japan, where it moves through its Bonin Islands, past the Japanese-governed Volcano Islands in Micronesia, past the Mariana Islands like Guam, through the Western Caroline Islands like Yap and Palau, and ends in Western New Guinea. Finally, in the classical strategy, there was the third island chain. This line starts at the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and stretches through the vast center of the Pacific Ocean, through Hawaii, American Samoa, Fiji, and ends in New Zealand. In more recent times, as China's power has grown and as Beijing has displayed its ambitions for the Indian Ocean and Africa, some American national security experts have added 4th and 5th island chains to their planning. The 4th island chain moves southward from Pakistan through the Laskadweep Islands and the Maldives westward of the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota, which is controlled by China through its Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), and the important US-UK military base of Diego Garcia. The 5th island chain, meanwhile, starts with the United States Camp Lemonnier base in Djibouti on the Gulf of Aden and hugs the African coastline. Although the 4th and 5th island chains have not been formally codified into American national security strategy, most experts have informally accepted them as being part of the United States' overall plan of containment. The first island chain was and remains the most important part of Washington's containment strategy. It's the shortest, easiest to defend, and encompasses a significant portion of the world's population and economic activity, making it clearly more important than the other island chains. For China to become anything more than a regional land power, it must first break the containment of the first island chain. Unfortunately for Beijing, this presents numerous challenges. China is a nation that heavily depends on food and energy imports, much of which goes through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, which are contained within the first island chain. China's economy also depends on its exports, which also go through these maritime trade routes. Any disruption to these trade routes in either form would prove devastating for the Chinese economy, which is already slowing down after decades of breakneck growth. To make matters worse for Beijing, the first island chain presents a series of natural choke points that the United States and its allies could use to cut that shipping off. These include the Straits of Malacca, Luzon, and Miyako. For China, being able to get around these choke points is an item of top priority. It has approached the problem from 2 directions. First, it's invested a large portion of the wealth of its economic rise into a hefty military buildup, especially its naval and air forces. China now has the world's largest navy by sheer number of vessels, although not by tonnage, and this marks a key disadvantage. Despite its numbers, China's People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, is still not capable of surviving a direct confrontation with the United States Navy. However, Beijing understands its military disadvantage and has adapted to the situation with a strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD. This strategy is meant to make it too costly for the United States to project power into the first island chain, should conflict break out. In the event of a confrontation, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles ready to destroy American ships and bases in the region. As part of this strategy, China has built and militarized artificial islands in the disputed waters of the South China Sea. Some of these, such as Mischief Reef, host ship-killing missiles and runways for fighter jets and bombers. If China cannot yet kick the United States out of the first island chain,
It's raised the cost of projecting power into the area significantly, and might reasonably hope to make sustained forward presence there politically untenable in the war-weary American homeland. This is the tyranny of distance. The United States is adapting to China's A2AD strategy, though, which makes it imperfect for Beijing's ambitions. In early 2021, the United States made plans to establish a string of precision strike missiles along the First Island chain as part of a $27.4 billion military package centering on the Indo-Pacific theater over the following 6 years. The precision strike missile is a land-based ballistic missile with a range between 60 and 500 kilometers, which can be launched from mobile rocket artillery platforms like HIMARS, making this weapon durable and harder for China to remove from the board with missile attacks. The precision strike missile is the coming replacement for ATACMS and has recently entered service in a limited capacity. The US Army announced it had received its first batch of these missiles on December 8, 2023. Stationing these weapons along the First Island chain is, for Washington, a vital part of re-establishing a conventional deterrence that it acknowledges has eroded in recent years. Another of the most important adaptations for Washington to defend the First Island chain is through the presence of new bases in the Philippines, which began in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement (EDCA) and has expanded in 2023. Presumably, some of the precision strike missiles slated for delivery to the theater will be placed in these bases. China had once hoped to court the Philippines into its orbit, despite the dispute in the South China Sea under the friendly Rodrigo Duterte presidency. As part of this effort, China was supposed to invest $24 billion in BRI-related projects. Securing investment and strategic infrastructure in the Philippines would have been very valuable to Beijing, as it would have helped to break China's containment in the First Island chain. However, the BRI investments never truly panned out, and Duterte's successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., withdrew from the project in late 2023. The end result? The United States has increased its presence in the Philippines, while China remains shut out. The crown jewel in China's ambition to break out of the First Island chain is a conquest of Taiwan, which the People's Republic has always considered a rogue province left over from the Civil War and century of humiliation. As Taiwan sits at the center of the First Island chain, its importance was recognized as soon as the Chinese Communist Party came to power. As early as the 1950s, the United States committed to keeping the Communists out of Taiwan. When the mainland bombed the outlying Kinmen and Matsu Islands where Taiwanese troops were stationed and set off the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the United States Congress and the Eisenhower administration made it clear that they would use military force to destroy a Chinese invasion. Dulles even publicly threatened a nuclear attack on the Chinese mainland if the Communists attempted to take the island. China had no choice but to back down, a dynamic that has repeated since then. China's more recent military buildup has increased the importance of Taiwan. For the first time, American national security officials are not entirely confident that the United States military can successfully defend the island, at least not without tremendous cost that the American public might be reluctant to bear. However, the United States continues to arm Taiwan through the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. With this help, Taiwan has adopted what it calls a porcupine strategy, which aims to make the cost of an invasion as bloody as possible for Beijing. In a series of war games from January 2023, the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that out of 24 scenarios, China succeeded in an invasion twice, but it only did so when the United States did not intervene or when Japan did not allow it to use the bases in its territory. Even when China did succeed in conquering the island, it came at a cost of 70,000 casualties and 23,000 deaths. In a more realistic scenario, the costs would be far greater. Again, bad news for Beijing. The present situation suggests that for China, attempting to break out of the First Island chain by military means is still too difficult or costly. However, many experts are still worried. If China were to break the containment of the First Island chain, the line would become longer and much more difficult to defend, even if it's closer to the American homeland. For example, the United States Airforce would have a harder time projecting power, as refueling operations would need to move north to keep tankers out of range of China's fighters. The United States Navy would lose command of the First Island chain's choke points and would be more vulnerable to a Chinese missile threat that would extend hundreds of miles further east. For these reasons, the United States has invested more heavily in the second island chain in recent years to shore up the region's defenses. This comes in response to China's moves. For example, China has tried to expand its BRI into Micronesia, This is part of its strategy toward deeper political and economic integration in pursuit of its ultimate goal, which is to build bases in the second island chain that will allow it to project military power there. However, China's efforts in the area have met controversy. 2 months before leaving office in May 2023, former Micronesian President David Penuelo claimed that China had tried to threaten, bribe, and otherwise pressure his country's officials to go along with its strategic goals. So far, though, China has had no luck in building a base in the second island chain. Unfortunately for Beijing, the United States also has deep ties to the region. It already has unlimited military access rights to Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. These rights are part of a pact between Washington and the Freely Associated States (FAS) of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. This military access is expanding its infrastructure too, to make it more robust. In the summer of 2021, the United States and Micronesia agreed to build a new base there to allow a more permanent American military presence. So far, because of its territory in the area and the deep ties between Washington and the FAS, the United States has largely kept China at bay in the second island chain, and it's being assisted by Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan in doing so. All of these countries understand that allowing China to build a presence in the second island chain would make them more vulnerable. China has had more success in the third island chain. The third island chain is important because it sits on the lines of travel and commerce between the United States and Australia. In World War II, the Japanese Empire attempted to disrupt this line. In the 21st century, China has increased its investments in the area, potentially hoping to do the same thing the Japanese tried to do. As part of this effort, China has increased its ties with the Solomon Islands and Kiribati. In the Solomons, China has taken advantage of increasing estrangement between that country and Australia. When the anti-Australia Manasseh Sogavare returned to power as Prime Minister in 2019, Beijing seized on the opportunity. The Solomons withdrew its recognition of Taiwan that year and signed a memorandum of understanding that permits China to deploy its police forces to deal with internal unrest. The MOU also allows for some Chinese military presence. Although it does not permit the creation of a base, it allows for some rotational basing of Chinese military personnel. The expansion of China's security presence in the Solomon Islands is a direct threat to Australia, and it worries that country and its allies. Kiribati has also seen an increased Chinese presence. It too ended its recognition of Taiwan in favor of the mainland in 2019. In 2021, it signed on to a Chinese loan to lengthen an airstrip on the island of Canton. If this project is completed, China will have its easternmost facility. Although this will not be a full-blown Air Force base, it would give China an increased ability to conduct surveillance on the United States in the Third Island chain. Despite its success in the Third Island chain, however, Beijing has also encountered problems. The United States and Australia retain a big presence in the region. Tuvalu rejected China's attempts at influence. Meanwhile, China greatly desired to increase its presence in Papua New Guinea, which sits just north of Australia. China had hoped to incorporate Papua New Guinea into its infrastructure financing and renovate a port there that could be turned into an ideal base for the PLAN. Instead, Papua New Guinea offered the facility to the United States and Australia in a joint arrangement. This base sits just outside the reach of China's missiles. Overall, despite its recent successes there, the balance of power in the Third Island chain still favors the United States. The Fourth Island chain is a relatively new concept in American national security circles, but China's interest in the Indian Ocean has brought it to prominence. With China relatively contained within the first 3 island chains in the Western Pacific, it sought alternatives to access the world's waterways. While the waters off the Chinese mainland are surrounded by hostile islands, the Indian Ocean is a much more open place. China has partially succeeded in establishing footholds along the Fourth Island chain. Investments in Pakistan have been one of the cornerstones of China's BRI. These investments, called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC), center on the port of Gwadar, which gives China direct access to the Indian Ocean. China has increased this access further with its BRI investments in Sri Lanka, which has included a Chinese takeover of the Hambantota port with a lease of 99 years. China gained control of this port after the initial investment in the infrastructure proved unprofitable and the Sri Lankans were unable to pay the debt they had accrued. This BRI-related infrastructure is important and could signal Beijing's military intentions in the Fourth Island chain. For example, in August 2022, a Chinese ship arrived in Hambantota. Beijing called this a survey ship. However, the ship had also been used for military purposes, tracking satellites and missiles. Western and Indian national security experts were alarmed at its appearance. Chinese officials in the area gave it a warm welcome, while senior Sri Lankan officials were not present at the ceremony. The arrival of this ship was seen as a litmus test of how far China plans to militarize the BRI investments in these areas. However, China's strategy in the Fourth Island chain has faced some problems as well. BRI projects in Pakistan have faced financial difficulties and even terrorist attacks, which have forced them to scale back. The investment in Sri Lanka is more successful from a strategic, if not an economic perspective. There's a big obstacle in the Fourth Island chain even if the BRI-related projects pan out and China can find a way to militarize the area: the Diego Garcia Naval Base to the south. The Diego Garcia Base allows the United States Navy and Air Force to rapidly project power into some of the most strategic areas in the world, like the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea. The advantage Diego Garcia gives the United States was punctuated in the summer of 2020, when 3 nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bombers arrived at the base. Diego Garcia is in fact only one of a select few bases equipped to handle the B-2, which requires careful climate-controlled hangars known as B-2 shelter systems. That such infrastructure will be built there signals how important this base is to Washington. Despite international controversy that China has understandably helped to fuel, it has no intentions of abandoning the base anytime soon. For China, having the infrastructure and the concentrated force required to overcome the United States military presence at Diego Garcia is a difficult challenge. Thus far, the United States maintains superiority in the Fourth Island chain and can disrupt China's strategy there. Finally, there is the Fifth Island chain. This one is unique as it features China's only actual overseas military base, the People's Liberation Army Support Base in Djibouti, which opened in 2017. The base is close to the United States Camp Lemonnier in the same country. Camp Lemonnier is closer to the coast than China's base is, however, which allows the United States greater leeway in projecting power into the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. As of now, the Fourth and especially Fifth Island chains are secondary theaters in the great power competition between the United States and China. However, they are an area of burgeoning importance. The moves China makes with its BRI investments in places like Sri Lanka will dictate how they evolve. Unsurprisingly, with all of these maritime disadvantages, China has had to find other ways to try and bypass its containment within the successive island chains. This is why the BRI has prioritized overland infrastructure investments and other beneficial arrangements across the Eurasian landmass, spanning from China to Europe. For example, China has increasingly imported Russian energy through overland pipelines since the war in Ukraine began, protecting its energy supply from the US Navy's patrolling in the First Island chain. However, with the difficulties that the BRI has faced, this has not proven to be a substitute for the true power projection that the successive island chains prevent China from achieving. Becoming a world superpower often requires favorable geography. The United States had such a geographical advantage from its inception. With weak neighbors and 2 vast oceans separating it from peer competitors, it avoided damage and disruption, and no one was in position to bottle up its trade or naval buildup. Geography has not been so kind to China. Surrounded as it is by hostile powers, China must come up with alternatives to project its power, but so far these have not proven satisfactory. Beijing may have plans to be the world superpower by 2049, but it would hardly be the first time that an authoritarian power could not deliver on its boasts. If China does not find a way around this problem, Xi Jinping's China dream will never come true. But what do you think? Will China be able to effectively break its containment within the island chains? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts.
China's plan to invade the relatively small yet globally significant island of Taiwan may be hitting a major roadblock. The Philippines, backed by the US, could influence China's invasion plans in a major China-Taiwan conflict. But what is it about the Philippines that makes them play such a pivotal role in this scenario? In the year 2023, Taiwan became the most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth. This de facto independent island nation 110 miles off the coast of the Chinese mainland sits at the center of the world's economic and geopolitical fault lines. Since it came to power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, a relic left over from its long civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed.
This was the period between 1839 and 1949, where China repeatedly found itself invaded, defeated, occupied, and partitioned by foreign powers. Taiwan's self-governing status is a reminder to the Chinese leadership of those times, and reunifying it with the mainland is one of the most important objectives for China's authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, who hopes that the process will be completed by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's ascendancy to power. There are many obstacles to this plan, but one of them is not so often cited: the Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines, its tense relationship with China, and how this nation threatens Beijing's grandest foreign policy ambition. Taiwan is important to the Chinese leadership not just for historical reasons, but because of its economic and geostrategic position. Economically, Taiwan hosts the world's most advanced semiconductor industry through the dominance of one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In 2021, Taiwan had 63% of the world's semiconductor market share, with 54% of the world total being through TSMC alone. These chips are at the heart of the world's digital economy and power everything from computers to the brake sensors in cars. For China, gaining control of this industry would be very desirable. Placing itself at the heart of the globe's high-technology supply chain has been a major priority for its geopolitical strategy, as seen in its Made in China 2025 plan. If the semiconductor shortage of the past few years made things more expensive, Beijing getting to dictate the supply chain of these vital components would increase the price tag of almost everything much further. Geopolitically, Taiwan also sits at the center of the First Island Chain, the series of islands that span from Japan to Indonesia. These islands act as a natural obstacle to China's expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Restoring Taiwan to Beijing's rule would break this chain and allow China to freely access the world's oceans without having to go through the choke points that the First Island Chain presents, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Miyako Strait. Controlling these choke points is one of the United States Navy's principal strategies for containing Chinese military expansion. If China were to take Taiwan, however, it would have the land and ports it needs to bypass those choke points, making containment much more difficult, if not impossible. The United States is Taiwan's most important potential ally. Officially, America treats Taiwan with a doctrine of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that it would come to the island's defense if it were to be invaded. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, it has long sold sophisticated weapons to the island nation to deter such an invasion from happening. With this equipment, Taiwan has pursued what it calls a porcupine strategy, fortifying itself as heavily as possible and building offensive assets to deal damage to the Chinese mainland, all to increase the costs China would incur for an invasion and hold out as long as it can while it awaits the aid of its allies. Japan would also play an important role in the defense of Taiwan. In December 2021, the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the United States and Japan would not be able to stand idly by if Taiwan were attacked. In 2022, only a few months before his shocking assassination, he urged the United States to drop strategic ambiguity and affirmatively say it would defend Taiwan. A Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, he said, because China establishing air superiority around Taiwan would cover Japanese airspace. A takeover of Taiwan would also allow China to threaten Japanese shipping even more than it does today with its militarization of the South China Sea. Japan is a resource-poor nation and must import raw materials and commodities to survive. It cannot allow China to dictate what goes on in the region's shipping lanes. However, for all the talk about Japan and its role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, far fewer people talk about the role the Philippines would play in such a scenario. Thanks to a renewed agreement with the United States, this is starting to change, and Taiwan may soon be able to count on the aid of the Philippines as it stares down the colossus across the strait. The Philippines, though much smaller than the United States and Japan, also has a keen interest in seeing that Taiwan does not become subject to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Philippines has now become a major player in the dispute over Taiwan. The entrance of the Philippines into the Taiwan question is a natural consequence of the diplomatic and military rivalry between it and China, which has occurred in the last decade. The Philippines and China have long had a bitter dispute over the waters of the South China Sea. In 2012, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a rock with valuable fishing sites and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was the start of a conflict between China and the Philippines over several rocks and island chains in the South China Sea. Other points of contention between the two nations include Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands, all of which China went on to occupy and fortify. The Philippines brought a suit in international court, and in 2016, a tribunal in The Hague ruled that all of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, based on a 9-dash line map drawn in the late 1940s, had no legal basis. Still, China ignored the ruling and occupies these rocks and islands to this day. China's aggressive policy in the area has naturally alienated the Philippines, which is a longtime ally of the United States. The United States has had bases throughout the Philippines since the Spanish-American War of 1898, but its presence is now starting to expand much more. The Filipino military is not a formidable fighting force, meaning that China has mostly been able to get its way in its disputes with the Philippines, despite the international tribunals ruling against it. The Philippines has an active army of about 100,000 active duty personnel, a navy with only a few vessels more fit for fighting than patrol boats, and about 25 combat aircraft. This means that militarily, the Philippines would contribute little to the defense of Taiwan, at least for now. However, the Philippines does have two advantages: its geographical position and its alliance with the United States, which it has now begun to ramp up ties with again after a period of frostier relations. In 2014, as the South China Sea dispute began to ramp up, the United States and the Philippines signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Under the terms of the EDCA, the United States would be able to expand its military presence in the Philippines, although the 2014 document did not specifically state where it would do this. Rather, the document only affirmed the principle that the armed forces of the Philippines would provide new locations for the United States Armed Forces. In 2016, 5 such locations were formally announced. These were, from north to south, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Besa Air Base in Pampanga, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. Of the 2016 locations, Antonio Bautista Air Base was the most important, as it was close to the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. However, as China's military buildup in the region has only grown since 2016, the United States and Philippines announced plans to further accelerate the EDCA in February 2023. In April, the Pentagon announced the creation of 4 new EDCA bases. These are Naval Base Camilo Osayas in Santa Ana, Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela, Balabac Island in Palawan, and Laulo Airport in Cagayan. Not coincidentally, 3 of these 4 locations are in the northern Philippines, which makes the intentions of that expansion clear. The new bases are to help deter a potential invasion of Taiwan by allowing the United States to more easily project power into a critical area, the Luzon Strait. The Luzon Strait is one of the first island chain's strategic choke points. It is a 160-mile gap of water between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island, Mavulis, is even closer, at only 118 miles away from the world's most disputed hotspot. Here is where we see the role that the Philippines would play in the defense of the world's most hotly contested island. In the first place, the bases give the United States and its regional allies additional options to choke off shipping to China. As China is heavily dependent on foreign food and energy imports, this is something that the country's leadership will need to take seriously and helps aid the process of deterrence. Geographically, the bases strengthen a potential new front to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan if deterrence fails and hostilities actually become a reality. In the necessary amphibious operation, China would now likely be facing a pincer movement of forces moving south from Japan and north from the Philippines, adding to the already immense difficulty of pulling off a successful waterborne maneuver and establishing a beachhead across the Strait of Taiwan. An amphibious invasion is hard enough. An amphibious invasion that would need to fend off American and Allied forces on 2 sides, that would be almost impossible, especially with a lack of surprise on the invaders' side. The bases also better prepare the United States and its other allies in the region, such as its Quad partners Japan and Australia, for war. Their locations make them ideal places to stage military exercises simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Although there is no true substitute for actual combat operations, the better prepared military force will usually get the better of an engagement, something the Chinese brass should know well, since the principle goes all the way back to Sun Tzu.
The new bases in the Philippines certainly increase the preparation the United States and its allies can make for a coming invasion. The renewed military partnership between the United States and the Philippines also offers the prospect of improving that country's military readiness as well, which, as we have seen, is badly needed. As China's policy in the region has routinely seen the Philippines bullied, it is likely that policymakers in Manila will want to take advantage of the opportunity that the new bases provide. Indeed, the United States and the Philippines have already conducted drills in the Luzon Strait, which will lead to improved Filipino readiness in the long run. Someday soon, the Philippines could join joint exercises not only with the United States, but with its partners in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Japan, Australia, and possibly even India. The new bases in the Philippines also help to reduce one of China's major advantages, which had been eroding the United States' share of the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Namely, the bases help to mitigate the tyranny of distance. This term describes the disadvantage the United States would face by fighting thousands of miles away from its homeland. It would need to ship troops, supplies, and other essentials over those thousands of miles of ocean, where China's troops and supplies would only need to travel a little bit from their homeland. The vast distance also has a negative effect on morale at the home front, because it makes Americans wonder what the war is really about. This was a big factor in contributing to the political controversies in America's interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, and it is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the country's history. With China's development of anti-access area denial (A2AD) capabilities, the tyranny of distance has magnified. The long American supply lines would make ripe targets for China's A2AD strategy, but the bases in the Philippines give the United States more options. It can now position many more assets close to the area where the fighting over Taiwan would be taking place, making China's A2AD harder to carry out. For example, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that threatens all of America's bases in the region. But the more targets there are to hit, and the more air defense systems get concentrated along the bases, the faster China's missile depletion becomes. Some of the missiles will hit, but the bases in the Philippines mean that now China has more targets to hit and more air defense systems to deal with. The bases in the Philippines ultimately mean the attrition math will shift more in favor of the United States and its allies, even though they would still take terrible damage in an all-out Chinese missile attack. Still, surviving assets can more confidently be brought forward to act when the reign of missiles ends. In this way, the new bases in the Philippines are in line with the United States' third offset strategy, which it codified in the mid-2010s. Meanwhile, the new base means that the United States will be able to position more assets that can hit the Chinese mainland too, further undermining China's A2AD strategy and increasing the costs of a conflict exponentially and further aiding deterrence. The agreement with the Philippines, however, prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in the bases, so the EDCA is not a nuclear umbrella type of agreement. That is one of the few items of solace for the Chinese leadership. For the Philippines, the renewal and expansion of the EDCA marks a return to its traditional close relationship with the United States. Despite the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, flirted with forging closer relations with China in order to reduce the country's dependence on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has proven more traditional in pursuing the Philippines' alliance with the United States. The new base also includes an investment worth over $82 million for infrastructure and access to resources for those bases. This investment will be a good source of jobs for local Filipino residents, meaning that they aid the United States not only in its projection of military power, but economic influence. Therefore, aside from the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, the bases also affect one of the cornerstones of Chinese policy: economic coercion. China has long used its financial and industrial power to exert leverage over the domestic politics of other nations. We have even witnessed this in action in the United States, with certain Hollywood filmmakers carefully curating their content to not offend Chinese sensibilities, and the 2019 controversy in the NBA about the fate of Hong Kong, which was erupting with protests at the time. The effects are far more profound elsewhere. For example, China has used its economic leverage over many Muslim-majority nations to buy their silence regarding the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in its western Xinjiang province, which the United States State Department, the British Parliament, and several other governments around the world have formally classified as genocide.
China's infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, among other projects, have also given it leverage over countries receiving the funds. Although the Philippines is technically a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, its Chinese-sponsored infrastructure development there has only been limited and is highly controversial among the Filipino public. Despite China's attempts to make inroads, the United States and its respective companies remain the heaviest source of foreign investment in the Philippines. The situation has limited the Chinese government's ability to exert economic coercion over that country. In the past, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership could have hoped to buy at least the neutrality of the Philippines concerning the Taiwan issue, but with the new bases and both the military and economic ties that it brings with the United States, this possibility just got sharply reduced. The failure of China to bring the Philippines into its orbit, despite the 6 years of friendly Duterte presidency, severely threatens Beijing's plans for Taiwan. Geographically, the Philippines is just too important to the success or failure of an operation to take the island. The Philippines now actively coming onto the side of the United States makes the already difficult operation even more difficult for China, and the problem is only likely to get worse for Beijing. Unlike China, the Philippines is increasing in population. It is expected to increase from the current 117 million to about 180 million by the end of the century. Meanwhile, China's population peaked in about 2020 and is now declining. It is expected to shrink from 1.4 billion to about 776 million by the end of the century. The Philippines' economy is growing as well, with an average annual GDP growth of 6.4% since 1990. As the Philippines' population economy grows, it will be an even better source for American investment, and the new wealth will give the Philippines the opportunity to expand its military power in the future. Add this reality to China's economic and demographic problems, and the window for the mainland to reunify with the island through use of force might be closing rapidly. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was not happy about the renewal of the EDCA and the expansion of American military bases and financial investment in the Philippines. When the news came, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States and Philippines of increasing tension in the region and helping to destabilize it. For the Philippines, though, there is little choice but to strengthen its ties with the United States. As another country in the first island chain, it would be even more subjected to China's whims if it took control of Taiwan. Just like Japan, its airspace would be under threat if China controlled the skies over Taiwan. Its shipping and maritime commerce, already under stress from China's occupation of strategic real estate in the South China Sea, would be that much more inhibited. When seen in this light, it was probably foolish for the Chinese leadership to believe that the Philippines would ever come under its orbit to the extent that countries in the Eurasian interior would. In the affairs of nations, security considerations will almost always win out over economic considerations. Because of its geopolitical position, the Philippines cannot let China secure a hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific region, which it would do if Taiwan were to fall. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Philippines to forge ties with and host the military of the only nation that can prevent such a thing from happening, the United States. China may have thought time was on its side, but the renewal of the EDCA might just mean that by 2049, China will be unable to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, let alone actually succeed in its plan. But what do you think? Do the new American bases in the Philippines shift the region's balance of power and threaten China's plans to invade Taiwan? If so, how heavily? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Why and in what way are the Philippines important to US Pacific strategy? In the 1990s and 2000s, the United States could afford to bask in its victory over the Soviet Union, as no other state in the international system was capable of challenging its global preeminence. That rapidly changed in the 2010s, as the economic and military rise of China upended American foreign policy. For the first time since the Cold War, the United States faced a near-peer competitor in a region of the world, the Indo-Pacific, which had become the engine of the global economy. America's costly Middle Eastern adventures in the War on Terror had contributed to a lack of full readiness to meet the new challenge, and national security experts in Washington had warned that slowly but surely, the United States was losing its traditional military advantage in the region, as China rapidly began to modernize its armed forces and concentrate hard power in the seas and skies of the First Island chain, where the world's most strategic trade routes transited.
The pivot to Asia strategy of the Obama administration signaled that the United States now had a new top foreign policy priority: contain China's ambitions and prevent it from becoming a regional superpower in the Indo-Pacific. The Trump and Biden administrations both continued and expanded this policy, making it a rare area of bipartisan consensus in the increasingly polarized world of American politics. Unsurprisingly, as part of this containment policy, all three administrations have heavily courted the Philippines. In this video, we will look at the relationship between the two countries and at just how important the Philippines is to American geopolitical strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States and the Philippines have a deep relationship that goes back to 1898, when it became an American colony after the Spanish-American War. After the brutal Philippine-American War and Moro Rebellion, the colony was peaceful for a time, until it saw some of the worst fighting in World War II. The Philippines achieved its full independence from the United States in 1946, but America retained military bases there until 1992, when the Navy handed over its base on Subic Bay to the Filipino government. The closing of the base seemed to mark a turning point not only for the Filipino-American relationship, but for the region, as it was the last US military outpost in Southeast Asia. With the Cold War over and the United States the world's undisputed hegemon, there seemed to be no need for such a presence. However, the Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, between the United States and the Philippines, which came into force in 1951, remained on the books. The MDT would play a critical role in America's return to its former colonial possession. The rise of China changed the equation in the region, and in 2012, the new reality affected the Philippines in a dramatic way. In that year, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, an atoll with valuable fisheries and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, as per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. However, China ignored UNCLOS and claimed that the shoal was its territory based on its infamous 9-dash line map, which it uses to assert ownership of 90% of the South China Sea. By the summer, Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels had excluded Filipino ships from the Scarborough Shoal, walling off its lagoon. China has effectively controlled the territory ever since, but the dispute over the Scarborough Shoal continues to this day, despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruling against China in 2016. On December 10, 2023, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels used water cannons to disrupt the resupply of Filipino fishermen by civilian ships off the Scarborough Shoal. Other Filipino ships were rammed, and one of them suffered engine damage. The incident was the latest display of Filipino vulnerability to Chinese territorial expansion in these critical waterways. Shortly after seizing the Scarborough Shoal, China ramped up its drive for territory in the South China Sea. It took the Spratly Islands, which lie close to the Philippines, and eventually fortified them with artificial islands that host military infrastructure such as radar stations, missile silos, anti-aircraft and anti-ship weapons, and even in some cases airfields. With China's military presence in the region growing and the Filipino military in no condition to dispute Beijing's moves, there was little choice but for the Philippines to renew its military alliance with the United States. The first step in the process came in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. The EDCA brought American troops back to the Philippines for the first time in over 20 years. Under this agreement, the Philippines granted new bases for the United States Armed Forces to operate on its territory, although it retained ownership of the sites. Additionally, the terms of the EDCA state that the United States must cover the cost of the bases, although it does not need to pay rent. The Philippines not charging such rent demonstrated how important a renewed American military presence in the area became for Manila. Initially, 5 locations were agreed to host American forces. One of them was Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija. The others were unsurprisingly concentrated further south, toward the disputed waters of the South China Sea. One of the new bases, Antonio Batista Air Base, was very close to the contested Spratly Islands, giving the United States the ability to rapidly project power to counter China's military buildup in the area. The southern dominant locations of the first 4 EDCA bases signaled Manila's priorities for the new partnership. It needed assistance in the South China Sea dispute and was worried about China's aggression and potential to seize more territory from the Philippines. For the United States, the EDCA presented new options for it to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific and for maintaining freedom of navigation in the economically and geopolitically critical South China Sea. So while it did not receive financial assistance under the EDCA in the way it does for its bases in Japan and South Korea, Washington was more than happy to pay the costs if it meant a renewed foothold in Southeast Asia. However, the burgeoning renewal of military ties between the Philippines and the United States would soon meet a snag. The EDCA was negotiated and signed by Filipino President Benigno Aquino III, who served from 2010 to 16, and saw the South China Sea dispute ramp up. His successor, Rodrigo Duterte, was far more skeptical about the United States. In fact, he announced the Philippines' separation from Washington during his first year in office. Many international observers accused Duterte's administration of having authoritarian tendencies, where extrajudicial killings of suspected drug traffickers were permitted. Abroad, Duterte announced early that he would pursue an independent foreign policy. Technically, this policy is mandated in the Filipino constitution, but in practice, it meant that despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Duterte tried to forge closer relations with Beijing and Moscow in an attempt to reduce the Philippines' dependence on the United States. On a 2016 trip to Beijing, Duterte said, "America has lost. I've aligned myself in your ideological flow." Because of Duterte's foreign policy, the EDCA's full implementation faced numerous delays between 2016 and 2021. For example, on February 11, 2020, Duterte reached the height of his aversion to the United States and announced he would be ending the US-Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement (VFA). The VFA allows American troops to easily deploy to the Philippines to address emergencies or potential contingencies, such as the event of an invasion of Taiwan. The VFA's clauses state that the agreement will remain in place for 180 days after the announcement of a cancellation. Duterte subsequently authorized 2 extensions in June and November of 2020, and the VFA was never cancelled in reality. If it had been cancelled, it would not have voided the MDT, though it would have made implementing it and the EDCA much harder. It amounted to little more than hot air in the end, but the episode showed how far the Philippines had drifted out of America's orbit during most of Duterte's presidency. Then, late in 2021, Duterte abruptly began to change course. Manila endorsed the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, re-established the Philippines-United States bilateral strategic dialogue, and announced that joint military exercises would be expanded. External pressures had forced his hand. In early 2020, Chinese militia boats encircled the Philippines' Titu Island to prevent the Filipinos from making infrastructure improvements on it. A year later, China authorized its Coast Guard to fire upon foreign vessels if required. Meanwhile, China's promised infrastructure investment in the Philippines, which Duterte hoped would help fulfill his build, build, build infrastructure plan, never materialized. Rodrigo Duterte's term as president ended on June 30, 2022. His successor, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., was much more aggressive in distancing the Philippines from China and restoring ties with the United States. The EDCA, after facing so many delays under Duterte, was reinvigorated in November 2022, with $66.5 million worth of project improvements at the first 5 locations. The new construction projects included training facilities, warehouses, and other vital infrastructure. The EDCA accelerated in its scope in April 2023, with 4 new bases being announced. Their locations were concentrated in the northern Philippines, with the clear aim of deterring an invasion of Taiwan. The addition of Taiwan to the EDCA's mission, even if unofficial, indicates a security partnership between the Philippines and the United States that is expanding in its purview. To prove the point, the new bases were followed up with the first quadrilateral defense meeting between the United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines in June, which took place between the countries' respective defense chiefs. The Philippines has participated in more joint exercises since Marcos took power, giving its military valuable experience and increasing its readiness for a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific region. It seems likely that the Philippines will soon join South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam in the Quad Plus arrangement. For the United States, the presence of the Philippines within its coalition in the Indo-Pacific region cannot be overstated in its importance. The Philippines does not have the economic or military might of the Quad members, but geographically, it's on par with Japan in its importance. The Philippines is part of the first island chain, which forms a natural barrier to containing China's military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan is one of the strategic shipping lanes through which the United States Navy and Air Force can potentially cut off Chinese trade. The new bases in the Philippines make this operation far easier to carry out, adding to the United States' leverage over China and enhancing deterrence against a potential invasion of Taiwan. Meanwhile, in March 2021, the United States announced plans to station new missiles around the first island chain as part of a military spending package over the following 6 years. Part of the new missile arsenal will likely include the Precision Strike Missile, which is the coming replacement for the ATACMS. This weapon, a short-range ballistic missile, will have an effective range of 500 kilometers, with the ability to deliver cluster munition-compliant payloads. In addition to their precision strike capabilities over such long ranges, these missiles can be launched from mobile systems like HIMARS, making them harder for enemy missiles to detect. There can also be more of them taking to the skies at a given time, because HIMARS launchers can carry 2 precision strike missiles as opposed to 1 ATACMS. The US Army received its first batch of precision strike missiles in December 2023. Their arrival would assist the United States' goal of reinforcing a conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region that many national security experts in Washington believe has been eroded over recent history. While there have been no formal announcements, it's almost certain that some of the announced missiles will include the Precision Strike Missile. It's also likely that some of these missiles will be placed in the EDCA bases in the Philippines. Although the Precision Strike Missile does not have the range to cross the distance from the Philippines to the Chinese mainland, it can hit China's artificial islands if placed in locations like Antonio Batista Air Base. More importantly, the Precision Strike Missile would play a large role in combating an invasion of Taiwan. The distance between Taiwan and the northern Philippines is only about 250 kilometers. A series of hard-to-find HIMARS launchers based in the northern Philippines would disrupt and make a potential invasion more costly. HIMARS launch precision strike missiles near one of the new EDCA sites in particular, Naval Base Camilo Osayas at the very northern edge of the Philippines, could be particularly damaging to any Chinese invasion effort. Although the base would be targeted in a confrontation, as we have seen in Ukraine, HIMARS launchers are easy to hide, which is one of the reasons why the National Defense College of the Philippines called for their presence on Filipino soil. Washington was happy to oblige. HIMARS launchers have already taken part in military exercises on Bosco Island in the northern Philippines. These drills likely simulate how they would be used in a scenario of an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. American and Filipino armed forces have also conducted live-fire drills involving HIMARS and defensive systems like the Patriot missile. These exercises came on the coast of the South China Sea, where their intent was clear. The United States is developing other missiles with longer range. Another weapon the NDCP called for stationing on Filipino soil is the coming long-range hypersonic weapon. This weapon is designed to have a range of 1,725 miles, enough to reach targets in the Chinese mainland from the Filipino bases. To make matters better for Washington and Manila, the LRHW is a land-based, truck-launched weapon, which means it's easier to hide. The LRHW can reach velocities of 3,800 miles per hour. After launch, they move to the top of the atmosphere, staying beyond the reach of enemy missile defense systems, and then when ready to strike, make their descent, too late to be intercepted. The LRHW is designed specifically to defeat enemy anti-access area denial strategies of the type that is at the heart of China's strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The LRHW uses a booster rocket motor to reach hypersonic velocities. Afterward, the glide vehicle detaches from this booster and can travel at speeds of Mach 5 or higher on its own. The US military's deployment of this weapon has suffered delays. Tests in October 21 and June 22 proved unsatisfactory. In September 2023, the Army admitted that it would not be able to meet its goal of deploying the LRHW by the end of fiscal year 2023. Once deployed, though, the LRHW will add new dimensions to conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Their being based in the Philippines will be geographically critical to deterring China's ambitions for the South China Sea and an invasion of Taiwan. Despite Rodrigo Duterte's high personal popularity, polling data in the Philippines shows that most Filipinos did not agree with him on a separation from the United States and for closer ties to China. Public opinion on America remains high within the country, while most Filipinos have little regard for China. In a June 2022 scientific survey of 1,200 adults in the Philippines, respondents suggested that their country should trust the United States, Japan, and Australia the most, while trusting China and Russia the least. 31% of those surveyed said they had a great deal of trust in the United States, while 58% said that the United States should be given at least a fair amount of trust, making for a total trust rating of 89%. 79% trusted Japan, and 78% placed their trust in Australia. Only 38% trusted Russia, and 33% trusted China. On the flip side, 36% of Filipinos said their country should extend not too much trust in China, while 31% said China should not be trusted at all, making for a total distrust rate of 67%. The sample had a 95% confidence interval at an error rate of plus or minus 2.8%. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president of the Philippines, it was no coincidence that his first congratulatory call came from Joe Biden. According to family members and other sources close to Marcos, he was personally flattered by the speed and attentiveness of the call. Marcos subsequently took 2 trips to the United States in less than a year, and high-level officials in the Biden administration responded in kind. There has been some controversy, given Marcos's parentage and ties to the late dictator's regime, but security considerations always win out over economic or moral ones in international relations, and Washington has proven keen to regard the past as water under the bridge. There is good reason for the charm offensive. The Philippines is a critically important staging ground in any scenario involving Taiwan and in preserving the integrity of the First Island chain, the primary line of defense against Chinese military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The balance of power in the region has indeed eroded, as China's buildup of missiles, ships, planes, and troops has tipped the scale of hard power away from the United States. China's potential with hypersonic weapons has made this eroding deterrent clearer. China can concentrate all of these forces in the region, while the United States is divided into many global commitments. Therefore, America is counting on its alliances with the First Island chain countries to act as a geopolitical force multiplier. The Philippines is critical along that chain of containment. China had an opportunity to bring the Philippines far closer to its orbit and potentially break through the First Island chain during the Duterte presidency. There was even a plan for Chinese companies to take over a shipyard in Subic Bay, the site of the American naval base that had shuttered in 1992. However, senior Filipino government officials worked behind the scenes to kill that deal. They did not trust China, which had not altered its aggressive behaviors in the region. These behaviors, such as bullying Filipino ships out of their internationally recognized territorial waters and not delivering on their Belt and Road-related economic development promises, ultimately meant that Beijing could not take advantage of the Duterte presidency to alter the geostrategic situation in the region. China has long been a country that has failed to live up to its fullest potential. The geopolitical alignment of the Philippines might prove to be just the latest example in that history. Some Filipinos and international observers speculate that Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter and current vice president of the Philippines, could one day ascend to the higher office and follow her father's policies regarding Beijing. But for now, that's just speculation. The renewal of ties between the Philippines and the United States and the buildup of infrastructure there are critical to the national security interests of both countries. And with such high stakes, relationships tend to have a ghost-in-the-machine dynamic. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency was a good example of this in action. What do you think about the renewal of ties between the United States and the Philippines? How important is the Philippines to America's national security strategy? And how important is the presence of American troops on Filipino soil to that country's well-being in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more military analysis from military experts. As China seeks to further its presence in the waters of the Pacific, it has commissioned a new supercarrier to add to its fleet that they are hoping will compete with the US Navy's new Gerald Ford supercarrier. But how does the Fujian compare to the Navy's newest addition to its carrier fleet? Does it have the technological capabilities to compete with modern blue water carrier fleets? What is the likely military doctrine that will outline its use in battle? In this video, we will seek to answer these questions and more. Let's delve right in. Much of what we know about the new Fujian is based on reconnaissance imagery and intelligence analysis. The Chinese Type 003 Fujian supercarrier has a 316-meter flight deck and has a beam of 76 meters at the flight deck. It is conventionally powered by 8 boiler steam turbines, producing approximately 220,000 horsepower at its 4 shafts. The Fujian is expected to utilize electromagnetic catapults, a step up from the ski jump configuration of its predecessors. Its displacement will be about 80,000 tons with a full combat load, though recent intelligence suggests that it may actually displace closer to 100,000 tons. The ship will be crewed by approximately 2,000 sailors and 60 flag staff officers. The endurance of the Fujian is not yet known, however. The Type 002 carrier Shandong has a top speed of 31 knots and a range of 25,928 kilometers, 16,000 miles, at 14 knots. Similar performance is expected from the Fujian, though top speed is slightly slower at 29 knots. Construction on the Fujian began sometime in the 2010s, though the exact date is currently unknown. Construction was paused briefly as the electromagnetic catapult system was developed, but resumed again in the late 2010s. The ship's modules went into dry dock in mid-2020, and reports were that a launch of the vessel was possible by mid-2022. These reports turned out to be accurate, as the Fujian was launched on 17th of June 2022, sporting the hull number 18. The Electromagnetic Catapult Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS as the US refers to it, utilizes a linear induction motor as opposed to the steam piston catapults of other carriers. This represents a significant technological jump for the Chinese, as they have skipped developing conventional steam-driven catapults altogether. The new system has several advantages over steam piston systems, chief of which are reduced stress on the airframe due to a more uniform acceleration, as well as being lightweight, easier to maintain, and faster to reset. The development of the EMALS system was spearheaded by China's top naval engineer, Rear Admiral Ma Wei-ming. The new catapult system will allow the launch of larger and heavier aircraft. The aircraft carrier is expected to utilize a modified J-15 fighter variant for its main fighter wing, until a dedicated fifth-generation fighter can be developed for carrier-based operations. In 2021, intelligence analysts concluded that the People's Liberation Army had developed the J-15B, which includes CATO bar, or Catapult-Assisted Takeoff but Arrested Recovery. The new variant also included an upgraded avionics suite, newer engines, and the ability to launch upgraded missiles. The fighter air wing is expected to consist of 55 modified J-15 fighters. The J-15 carries a crew of 1 to 2 depending on variant and mission. It has a length of 22.8 meters, 73 feet and 1 inch, and a wingspan of 15 meters, 49 feet and 3 inches. It has a gross weight of 27,000 kilograms, 59,000 pounds, and a max takeoff weight of 32,500 kilograms, 71,650 pounds. Max speed is reportedly Mach 2.4, with a ferry range of 3,500 kilometers, 2,200 miles. The aircraft reportedly uses 2 WS-10B turbofan engines. The engines are equipped with afterburners and each produce 30,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners lit. The J-15 is capable of carrying the following ordnance: 1 GSH-31 30mm cannon with 150 rounds, PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles, PL-12 medium-range air-to-air missiles, PL-10 short-range air-to-air missiles, YJ-83K anti-ship missiles, KD-88 standoff land attack missiles, YJ-91 anti-radiation missiles, plus assorted bombs and rockets. The aircraft is also capable of utilizing the UPAS-1A buddy refueling pod similar to F-18s in the US carrier fleet. The air wing is also expected to employ prop-powered transport aircraft and KJ-600 AEW and C airborne early warning and control. The KG-600 was specifically developed to take advantage of the Fujian's upgraded catapult system and will lessen the carrier's reliance on helicopters for AEW and C operations, as well as anti-submarine operations. The aircraft is the direct counterpart to the American E-2 Hawkeye and fills a similar role. The new aircraft made its maiden flight on 29th of August 2020, with flight testing continuing into 2021. The KJ-600 is a high-wing turboprop aircraft fitted with a large overhead radome. It's suspected that the radome houses an AESA-type radar system in a 3-way configuration. It has a crew of 3 to 5 airmen. It is 18.14 meters long, 59 feet and 6 inches, and has a wingspan of 25 meters, 82 feet. The tailplane is a quad-fin configuration for increased stability. The aircraft is powered by 2 Zuzu Wojiang 6C turboprop engines, each producing 5,103 horsepower. The engines spin 6-blade constant-speed feathering props which are capable of pitching to reverse thrust. The aircraft has a max gross weight of 30,481 kilograms, 67,000 pounds, and an empty weight of 25,401 kilograms, 56,000 pounds. It has a stated range of 1,250 kilometers, 780 miles, and a ferry range of 2,800 kilometers, 1,700 miles. The KG600 has a max speed of 693 kilometers per hour, 431 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of 15,000 meters, 50,000 feet. It's also possible that the air wing will consist of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and helicopters. It's anticipated that the air wing will consist of approximately 1,000 airmen. Defensive capabilities are expected to include 3 30mm close-in weapon systems, CIWS. These weapon platforms are to be outfitted with AESA radar and are able to intercept anti-ship missiles traveling at Mach 4+ with 96% accuracy. It's also believed that the carrier will employ short-range air defense missiles and anti-submarine rocket capabilities. While the Fujian has already been launched, it's not expected to be ready for combat operations until 2024 or 2025. Even still, the Fujian is expected to be the most capable non-US aircraft carrier deployed to date. It represents a giant leap forward for China's Navy, but is it enough to stand toe-to-toe with the United States? Well, one important factor to consider is how the carrier will be utilized. China does not have much experience in carrier operations. While the United States has the benefit of 100 years of experience, China is in a rush to play catch-up. Launching and recovering aircraft in all weather and lighting conditions is something that takes practice, solid operating procedures, and delicate orchestration. Reports indicate that as of now, Chinese aircraft still utilize land-based airfields precisely because of these shortcomings. They also lack experience in anti-submarine warfare and anti-ship missile detection and engagement. Though the KJ600 aircraft is being developed to deploy with the Fujian, it's not yet fully operational. Due to the fact that the carrier has conventional propulsion systems, it must cruise with a fuel tanker for sustained operation, exposing yet another vulnerability. Because of these factors, the carrier is likely to be utilized in regional waters in show-of-force operations, but lacks the experience, technology, and capability for effective and sustained combat operations in distant waters away from mainland resources. This effectively limits its use as a blue water Navy flagship in the modern arena. Gerald R. Ford-class supercarriers are the United States' latest carrier class, set to replace the current fleet on a one-for-one basis. It's expected that 10 carriers will be built and launched over the course of the upgrade process. It's expected that all 10 carriers will have combat capability by 2040. The first ship, the USS Gerald R. Ford (CVN-78), began construction in 2005, was launched in 2013, and was commissioned in 2017. CVN-78 is replacing the USS Enterprise (CVN-65). CVN-78 has a 337-meter flight deck with a 78-meter beam, just slightly larger than the Fujian. It utilizes 2 nuclear reactors for power and can reach speeds in excess of 30 knots. The nuclear power plant provides the Gerald Ford with an unlimited range. The ship utilizes 4 electromagnetic catapults as well as an advanced arresting gear system. Displacement with a full combat load is at 100,000 tons and has a complement of 508 officers and 3,789 enlisted men. The air wing employed on CVN-78, CVW-8 or Carrier Air Wing 8 consists of 4 Super Hornet squadrons, an E-2 Hawkeye squadron, an EA-18 Growler squadron, C-2A Greyhound squadron, and 2 MH-60 helicopter squadrons. At the time of this video, there are currently no 5th-generation F-35 Lightning II fighters attached to the air wing. However, this capability would not be difficult to add in the future as the F-18 begins to be replaced by the multi-role fighter. The F-18 Super Hornet is a supersonic twin-engine multi-role fighter. It is considered a 4th-generation fighter, which puts it in the same class as the J-15B. The Super Hornet has a crew of 1 to 2 depending on variant and mission. It has a length of 18.31 meters, 60 feet and 1.25 inches, and a wingspan of 13.62 meters, 44 feet and 8.5 inches. Max takeoff weight is 29,937 kilograms, 66,000 pounds, and has an empty weight of 14,552 kilograms, 32,000 pounds. The aircraft is capable of reaching 1.6 Mach and is powered by two General Electric F414-400 afterburning turbofans. Each engine is capable of producing 22,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners lit. It has a range of 2,346 kilometers, 1,458 miles, and a combat range of 822 kilometers, 511 miles. The fighter is armed with one 20mm M61A2 Vulcan cannon and 412 rounds of ammunition. It carries 4 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, 12 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, and 12 AIM-260 JAT-M missiles. It can also carry 6 AGM-65EF Maverick air-to-ground missiles, 4 AGM-84H Ki SLAM-ER missiles, 6 AGM-88 HARM missiles, 4 AGM-158 JASSM missiles, 4 AGM-154 Joint Standoff Weapon JSOW glide bombs, 4 AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, 4 AGM-158C LRASM missiles, JDAM bombs, laser-guided bombs, Mark 80 series bombs, and CBU-78 Gator mine systems. As far as avionics, the Super Hornet utilizes either the Hughes APG-73 or the Raytheon APG-79 radar systems. It also carries either the Northrop Grumman ITT ALQ-165 self-protection jamming system or the L3 Harris AN ALQ-214 integrated defensive electronic countermeasure system. The Raytheon AN ALE-50, BAE AN ALE-55 tow decoy, Raytheon AN ALR-67 radar warning receiver, and the MIDS LVT JTRS data link transceiver are also carried. The E-2 Hawkeye is the US Navy's aircraft for AEW&C operations, as well as anti-submarine operations. The Hawkeye is a high-wing, quad-tail, turboprop-powered aircraft. In looking at its physical appearance, you can see where the inspiration for the KJ-600 came from. It also has a large radome affixed above the wing. The aircraft first saw service on 21 October 1960 and has undergone many modifications and refinements since that time in order to meet the needs of the current battlefield. The current model E-2D has aerial refueling capability. It is 17.6 meters, 57 feet, and 8.75 inches long, and has a wingspan of 24.6 meters, 80 feet and 7 inches. It has a max takeoff weight of 26,082 kilograms, 57,500 pounds, and is powered by two Allison Rolls-Royce T59A427 turboprop engines. It has a 6-hour operational endurance time at sea, allowing sustained command and control operations. The C-2 Greyhound is a transport variant of the same aircraft. It's responsible for carrier onboard delivery (COD) operations. CVN-78 hosts a robust defensive weapons suite designed to protect the carrier from multiple avenues of attack. These include 2 Mark 29 guided missile systems, 2 Mark 49 guided missile systems, 3 Phalanx CIWS gun platforms, 4 Mark 38 25mm machine gun systems, and 4 M2 50 caliber machine guns. The defensive systems are tied together by upgraded AN Spy-3 X-band multifunction radar and AN Spy-4 S-band volume search radar. These systems are all tied to the SSDS or Ship Self-Defense System. This system has the ability to automate the fire control loop, which shortens the response time from detection of a threat to engagement of the threat. The Supercarrier also has stealth features, which are designed to reduce its radar cross-section. An additional feature of the carrier is the placement of the island, the superstructure which houses the bridge, air traffic control, and command center. The island has been placed aft on the carrier, opening up more space on the flight deck for aircraft to taxi. This change is expected to increase aircraft launch and recovery by nearly 30%. This increased efficiency allows for more sorties to be safely launched than the previous Nimitz-class supercarrier. The US Navy has been operating carriers since 1922, with the launch of CV-1, the USS Langley. With over 100 years' experience, the United States Navy has perfected the intricate ballet that is carrier operations. The current US Navy is capable of carrying out combat operations for extended periods of time before resupply day or night, in all manner of weather. China lacks this experience, however, they have the distinct advantage of trying to emulate the US Navy's operations procedures, technical capabilities, and proficiency. While they are aggressively playing a game of catch-up, at this stage it does not appear that they are at the same level as the United States. First, this is evident in the technological capabilities of the equipment they have deployed. The carrier, while large and technologically advanced as compared to the Type 001 and Type 002 carriers, has some serious shortcomings. It only has 3 catapults as compared to the Ford's 4. It does not have as robust a defensive electronics and weapons suite as the Ford. Perhaps its biggest shortcoming, however, is the propulsion system. Being conventionally powered, it must either cruise with a tanker for blue water operations or remain in regional waters, so the carrier would have to protect both itself and its fuel supply. This is a major blow to its combat capability, so the Fujian is likely to patrol regional waters well within the range of shore-based assets that can offer resupply and tactical assistance. This, combined with the strike group that carriers sail with, would offer enough protection to overcome these shortcomings, but at the expense of global reach. This may be good enough for the Chinese, as they may not necessarily be interested in global reach at this point. As President Nixon once stated, the Chinese tend to be firmly focused on China first, even at the expense of political doctrine. This is evident when viewing the alliances they hold, as they don't necessarily fall along the lines of political or economic dogma. So if they are primarily concerned with showcasing military might regionally, then the Type 003 may in fact fit the bill. Having said that, there are other areas that continue to hamper the effective use of the Fujian, beyond the capabilities of the carrier itself. The air wing seems to lag behind the United States in terms of capability and effectiveness. In comparing the J-15 to the F-18E, for example, the United States clearly has an edge. This advantage extends to not only the aircraft's capabilities, but in terms of ordnance carried, mission capabilities, and defensive capabilities. The Super Hornet has had the luxury of time to grow and mature, standing on the shoulders of the original F-18 and the experience gained from the F-14 program. The upgrades are purposeful and well thought out to suit the needs of the Navy and the US Department of Defense as a whole. It would seem that the upgraded J-15 had a less focused development and seems to be more haphazard without a clearly defined role. Sometimes more isn't always better, it's just more. The KJ-600, while very similar in aesthetic to the E-2 Hawkeye, doesn't have the same loitering time and avionics suite. It's true that the Chinese government has kept a tight lid on its capabilities. On the surface, it comes off as a less capable clone. Military technology will only get you so far, however. Tactics and training are often what wins the day. It is in this area where the largest difference between the two carriers and sailors on board is evident. As previously stated, the US Navy has been operating combat-capable aircraft carriers for 100 years. They have seen combat operations in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, the Balkans. The sailors on board train relentlessly to maintain a state of combat readiness that is based on experience and lessons learned in the high-stakes world of warfare. The Chinese do not share this experience or advantage. No Chinese carrier fleet has actively participated in combat operations. They have simulated strikes on islands. However, they don't have the real-world experience to adequately simulate the pressures of sustained operations where lives are at stake. The PLAN affords the average pilot 100 to 150 hours of flight time annually. US pilots, by contrast, typically fly 200 hours per year. US pilots and sailors are able to conduct combat operations anywhere, at any time, and in all manner of weather. Chinese pilots to date lack this capability. The United States also spends much time and resources training the carrier strike force to operate as a cohesive unit. Through years of experience, procedures, information flow, and command structure have all been carefully crafted to operate globally with extreme effectiveness. It is unknown how much China invests in cohesive combined arms training, but it would have to be overt and extreme to compete with the level of training the US fleet employs. Taking all these considerations into account, it's clear that if we were dealing with a carrier-to-carrier engagement, absent additional naval and mainland support, things would most likely end badly for the Fujian. However, when adding the support that the Chinese have available regionally, it's interesting to consider what would happen in a regional engagement between the two navies. If one were to conduct a thought experiment into what would happen if China were to take hostile action against Taiwan, we would first have to make some assumptions to get an idea of the playing field. First, let us assume that the Fujian would commence the engagement in the Taiwan Strait. Let's also assume that the Gerald Ford strike group was operating independently without support of additional carrier groups. Also, let us make the assumption that additional aircraft would not be provided by the Chinese mainland Air Force. Finally, let's assume a conventional, non-nuclear conflict where hostilities are already occurring and the rules of engagement allow for the full use of force. It would seem logical that the first order of business would be to establish air superiority and to limit the Fujian's mobility. This would mean removing its tanker from the fight through either subsurface, surface, or aerial means. The Ford has approximately 48 strike fighters available and can launch between 160 to 270 sorties a day. The Fujian has 40 strike fighters available, and based on existing figures from the Type 001 and 002 carriers, can launch 20 sorties per day, based on numbers gleaned from training exercises. This vast disparity of flight operations indicates that the Fujian Air Wing would likely be overwhelmed in actual combat conditions. This simple math does not take into account the early warning detection and electronic warfare capabilities the Ford enjoys. To further exploit the Fujian's weaknesses, the Ford would likely commit to night operations or foul weather operations that would further wreak havoc on the Chinese air wing. With its air wing decimated and an inability to maneuver, the Fujian's contribution to the fight would be marginal at best. From this standpoint, the Fujian seems like a paper tiger, but the reality is that the constraints that we put in our analysis are unlikely to exist in reality. The Chinese mainland forces would be unlikely to allow their fleet to be encircled and besieged. Likewise, the United States is unlikely to enter the fray without the support of allied nations or an additional carrier strike group. It is conceivable that in addition to Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, and even Vietnam would offer aid if not join the fight outright. The risk of the incident turning into a global conflict is very real and not to be taken lightly. However, even in this scenario, it seems unlikely that the Fujian would come out on top, especially if the conflict extended out into what is considered the second island chain. Current analysis seems to indicate that the Fujian serves a political role and a way of flexing regional muscle as a means of intimidating East and Southeast Asian countries, as China continues its effort to expand what it considers its territorial waters, a regional show of force that would augment the man-made islands and the airfields they have placed as footholds in disputed waters. In November of 2023, the Type 002 carrier Shandong and its strike group operated in the Taiwan Strait for 2 weeks and flew 420 J-15 sorties. This show of force, however, does not likely indicate an imminent threat to Taiwan, but can be used to assess how the Fujian is likely to be utilized. Analysts have also concluded that unlike the United States' use of the Ford as an offensive asset, the Chinese have adopted the Fujian as a defensive asset, specifically as it comes to the first island chain off the coast. China has placed most of its development and deployment on the ability to launch shipborne cruise missiles. It's likely that the carrier air wing is intended to protect these ships from attack, rather than offensively engaging targets like the United States doctrine. The Department of Defense has indicated that while they do not believe China currently has the capability of successfully invading Taiwan, they may by 2027. This is per testimony presented to Capitol Hill by Admiral Phil Davidson. One thing that is evident is that while that may be the case now, it's not something to be taken for granted. China is aggressively working toward creating a truly capable blue water navy. Ship to ship, China does have the largest navy in the world. They also possess superior industrial capabilities and can build and launch ships twice as fast as the United States. The next carrier in Chinese development is purportedly slated to be nuclear-powered, larger and with a more capable air wing. China is already looking at upgrading the J-15 air wing to a fifth-generation air wing and has successfully test-flown the J-35. The J-35 is the Chinese counterpart to the American F-35. We can only hope that the two superpowers never have to engage fleet to fleet. In addition to the catastrophic loss in life that a conflict of this magnitude would create, the economic impact on both countries would be catastrophic. Both countries have economies that are heavily dependent on each other. China owns majority shares in several US-based businesses. These facts make employing the calculus of war tricky, as the United States has never been in an adversarial position quite like this before. Only time will tell how the story will unfold. But what do you think? What would happen if China and the US found themselves in a fleet-to-fleet confrontation? Who would win? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.